I call this meeting to order. Bonjour et bienvenue tout le monde. Welcome to meeting number 21 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on National Defence. La réunion d'aujourd'hui se déroule sous la forme hybride. Today we are in hybrid form, and the members will be present in person or with the Zoom application. Deliberations will be published on the website of the House of Commons. For information, the web broadcasting will always show the person who's speaking rather than members of the committees. Participating virtually, just a few rules to follow. You may speak in the official language of your choice, and interpretation services are available for this meeting. If interpretation is lost, would you please inform me immediately, and we will ensure that interpretation is properly restored before returning to the proceedings. Okay, please, before speaking, wait until I recognize you by name, and all comments by members should be addressed through the chair. And when speaking, please speak slowly and clearly, and when you're not speaking, your mic should be on mute. With regard to a speaking list, the committee clerk and I will do our best to maintain a consolidated order of speaking for all members. Okay, we put in the agenda for today some committee business that was related to our subcommittee report. Really what it is lays out the scope for our next study, which is the military justice study. And if we wish to debate that or any other motion, I would suggest maybe we move it to the end of the proceedings so we have the time, maximum time available for our witness. Does anybody have an objection with that? Go ahead, Mr. Bazan.
Not that I have an objection, Madam Chair. I did file notice of motion to call the current Ombudsman, Greg Glick, if we can deal with that at the end of the meeting. And also just would like to get an indication from you how we're making out with some of the other invitations that went out to committee members or from committee to other witnesses we wish to hear from, like Elder Marquis and Zita Estraves, and see where we're at with those.
Okay.
You can give us an update, and also where we are with the call for the production of papers, which was in the motion that we passed a couple of weeks ago. Has the PCO complied and provided those papers to the law clerk, which is now being looked at, or is there a delay?
Okay, thank you. I can answer some of those questions now, or we can just wait to the end and we can discuss it all under committee business after the witness. Would 20 minutes?
My preference, if you could just give us a quick update right now on those two questions as to witnesses and production.
Okay, the witnesses all were invited. The next plan for Friday is to have Madame Sherman has confirmed for next Friday, as has Mr. Boland. We have not heard back from any other witnesses. Is that correct? Clerk says he is in a discussion with one other witness right now off that list. So that's all we have for now. As for the production of papers, they are in the possession of the law clerk at this present time. Any other questions? All right, then. So we'll let's leave then 20 minutes. Will that be enough at the end of the meeting to do the committee business? All right. Okay, then let's carry on then, and we'll come back to these issues with 20 minutes left to go in the meeting. Okay. All right. So, pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, February the 9th, 2021, the committee is resuming its study of addressing sexual misconduct issues in the Canadian Armed Forces, including the allegations against former Chief of the Defence Staff, Jonathan Vance. With us today by video conference, Mr. Ray Novak, former Chief of Staff to the former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. We'll start
Thank you very much, Mr. Novak, for accepting our invitation, and I would like to now invite you to make an opening statement. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity to contribute to the committee's work on this important matter. This is obviously a challenging and very difficult time for the Canadian Armed Forces, particularly for women in the Canadian Armed Forces. Madam Chair, I'll spend the next few minutes offering my recollection of the process used to replace the outgoing Chief of Defence Staff in 2015, in the hopes this can constructively contribute to improving these processes in the future. In doing so, I must note for the committee that I am relying on recollections of this period 6 years ago and publicly available sources and dates. I do not have access to public service records of the period. Political notes and records, including the Chief of Staff and Executive Office files, were donated to the Library and Archives Canada as part of the historical collection of Prime Minister Harper's tenure.
Excuse me, Mr. Novak, please. The interpreters
Yes.
are having a bit of a tough time. Can you raise your mic a little bit so it might make it a little easier?
Yes. Can you hear me clearly now?
Do I have thumbs up now? I can't.
Can you hear me clearly now?
Yes, thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Madam Chair, I'll spend the next few minutes offering my recollection of the process used to replace the outgoing Chief of Defence Staff in 2015, in the hopes this can constructively contribute to improving these processes in the future. In doing so, I must note for the committee that I am relying on recollections of this period 6 years ago and publicly available sources and dates. I do not have access to public service records of this period. Political notes and records, including the Chief of Staff and Executive Office files, were donated to the Library and Archives Canada as part of the historical collection of Prime Minister Harper's tenure. The selection process for the Chief of Defence Staff was run by an ad hoc committee constituted for this purpose. I believe the committee was composed of the Clerk of the Privy Council, the National Security Advisor, which is a senior position in the Privy Council, the Deputy Minister of National Defence, and the Minister of National Defence. The Prime Minister's Deputy Chief of Staff attended meetings of the ad hoc committee, as did the Chief of Staff to the Minister of National Defence. Operationally, PCO's National Security Advisor led the process. My general understanding was that the ad hoc committee undertook its work by reviewing prospective candidates from the senior ranks, seeking input from the current CDS and others, and building a list of potential candidates for consideration. Prospective candidates were then interviewed and assessed by the committee, and at the conclusion of the process, the views of committee members were consolidated into a written recommendation that was delivered to the Prime Minister via the Privy Council office. This same process was used to appoint General Natinchik and General Lawson. In early or mid-March 2015, the Prime Minister met with the Minister of National Defence to discuss the committee's recommendation. Prior to that meeting, the National Security Advisor briefed the Prime Minister on an issue relating to the leading candidate, General Vance. The NSA briefed that, while in Italy on a NATO deployment, the general was in a relationship with a U.S. officer who was subordinate to him, though not in his chain of command, and that the Canadian Armed Forces and Department of National Defence had reviewed the matter, that there was no open investigation or reprimand against the general. I believe we were also briefed that the U.S. Army review of their files indicated no reprimand of the other officer involved. In addition, we were informed that the U.S. officer in question was, by then in 2015, the fiancé of General Vance. Following the Prime Minister's meeting with the Minister of National Defence, a meeting with General Vance was scheduled. I attended that meeting along with our Deputy Chief of Staff. In the course of that meeting, the Prime Minister raised the issue of the General's time at NATO. He outlined the facts briefed to us by the Privy Council and asked if there was anything else he should know. I don't recall the General making any comment other than to state he and his fiancée were relieved the matter had been reviewed and was behind them. The appointment was publicly announced in April 2015, and the change of command ceremony was planned to occur in mid-July. Sometime in early July, 2 additional pieces of information were received. First, the Chief of Staff to the Minister of Veterans Affairs contacted me to relay a rumor that General Vance had an inappropriate relationship and or had improperly sought to further an officer's career during his time at CFB Gagetown, which I believe was in 2001. I advised the National Security Advisor about the call and asked him to investigate further. Around the same time, the National Security Advisor briefed the Prime Minister's office that an anonymous email had been received by a senior officer at the Department of National Defense. We were briefed that the email alleged an inappropriate relationship during the general's time at NATO, but contained no new information. However, we were informed that receipt of the email triggered a further review of the matter by the Canadian Armed Forces National Investigations Service. In subsequent conversations between the Prime Minister's office, the Privy Council office, and the Minister's office, it was agreed that the change of command ceremony would be delayed if needed to allow sufficient time for further investigation and review. In the course of the next week or so, the National Security Advisor briefed the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office that the NIS had found nothing further with respect to the general's time at NATO, and that their review of the matter was closed. As for the Gagetown rumor, the National Security Advisor briefed the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office that there was nothing in DND's files, no record of a complaint, and no current or former investigation. The NSA also briefed that he had discussed the rumor directly with General Vance, who responded that he had been in a public relationship with the named individual at the time, that this person did not report to him, and he denied improperly acting to further her career. As the facts relating to the general's time at NATO had not changed, and with no other known issues, the change of command ceremony proceeded on July the 17th, 2015. Now, in conclusion, Madam Chair, I'd like to add a final comment. Like all members of this committee, I have been deeply disturbed by allegations made in a number of recent interviews. Women in uniform, like all Canadians, have the right to a workplace free of harassment. Clearly, serious structural and cultural change is required so female members of the Canadian Armed Forces are not only protected, but also empowered to bring allegations forward to trusted, independent, investigative bodies. I hope that this committee's work contributes constructively to that process of change. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Novak. I will now open the floor for questions. First up, Mr. Bazan, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank Mr. Novak for his statement, and I also want to echo his sentiment that this is shocking what's been happening in the Canadian Armed Forces, and especially for the brave women who serve us in uniform. Just want to confirm, Mr. Novak, that unlike the current situation where the Minister of Defense, Harjit Sajjan, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, where they took no action, in the situation back in 2015 that Prime Minister Harper, yourself, the Defense Minister at the time, and others all questioned General Vance directly regarding any possible sexual misconduct.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As I said in my statement, when the Prime Minister met with General Vance in March, he did raise the issue that was known at the time pertaining to the General's time at NATO, and I indicated in my statement what the General's response was to that. After the appointment was announced in April, as I indicated, in some months later in early July, additional information was shared with us by our officials in the case of the anonymous email that was received. In that instance, the National Security Advisor briefed us that the NIS had again reviewed the matter and that had found no new information, and that the investigation at that time had been closed. With respect to the rumor that was passed to us, that was immediately conveyed to the National Security Advisor and Privy Council with a direct request to ascertain if there were additional facts, additional reviews or investigations needed to be undertaken, so that we could then delay the change of command ceremony to ensure we had any additional facts. And I have reported in my statement that the National Security Advisor came back advising us that, in fact, there was no record of a complaint, nothing in DND's files regarding this rumor, and that when he sat down with or spoke with General Vance directly about it, the general denied it, said he had been in a public relationship with the individual and had not improperly furthered her career.
So it's interesting that National Security Advisor to where we have Minister Sagen pushing away from the table and saying no and refused to look at evidence that was provided by the ombudsman at the time. Now, in hindsight, do you think the National Investigative Service received the full cooperation of General Vance, and did the NIS do their job adequately based upon the information that we know now?
Just with respect to the National Security Advisor, Madam Chair, absolutely. That is one of the most senior positions in the public service of Canada. That is a position that interacts regularly with the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's senior staff. It was fairly typical for me as Chief of Staff of the Prime Minister to speak to the National Security Advisor daily, sometimes multiple times a day. That was an individual who, in this particular process, was operationally the lead of the ad hoc committee and responsible for guiding that process and interacting on with the Department of National Defense and with the Canadian Armed Forces. With respect to the members' questions about the National Investigation Service, obviously the Prime Minister's office is not an investigative body. I did not have direct interaction with the NIS or the Canadian Armed Forces or the department on the matter. I was briefed via the Privy Council, primarily via the National Security Advisor.
So do you, Mr. Sagen's always saying that he put the complaint into the proper authorities, being the PCO. He said the PMO is not an investigative body. Is the PCO an investigative body?
What I'd say is the PCO is obviously the most department in the government of Canada. The Privy Council office is the department for the Prime Minister's office, and in a ad hoc committee process vetting a senior GIC appointment like the one we're speaking about, it is the PCO that is the conduit between the Prime Minister's office and in this case the department and the Canadian Armed Forces. And absolutely, in the case of the rumor that I mentioned in my statement, it was entirely appropriate that that rumor was brought to the Prime Minister's office, and B, that the Prime Minister's office immediately conveyed that information to the senior officials in the Privy Council office responsible for this appointment process, requesting them to review the matter, investigate the matter, and report back with any findings. And that's what was done.
Mr. Novak, do you believe that General Vance lied or misled you and the Prime Minister?
Well, what I would say to the member is, I think like all members of the committee, I watched the interview that Major Brennan gave some weeks ago, which is obviously deeply disturbing. And I think it's clear that she made extremely serious allegations. And if they are true, and I have no reason to doubt her, that means the general was not truthful with the Prime Minister in their meeting in March of 2015.
Based on your decade in the PMO, have you ever heard the Chief of Defense Staff referred to as anything other than Chief or CDS by the rank and name? Because what we always seem to have happening right now is that the government wants to refer to General Vance as Order in Council or Order in Council appointment or GIC.
No, Madam Chair, as far as I recall, the Chief of Defense Staff was always referred to with that title, both verbally and in written materials received from the Privy Council.
Then why would you think that in all the information that's come out through access to information requests and the aftermath of the testimony of Gary Walborn, that everything in there in the PCO referred to General Vance as a GIC appointee?
Madam Chair, I'm not sure I'm able to speak to that. I don't recall ever seeing that type of reference in written materials, but probably that's a good question for officials from the Privy Council.
So when you look at, you mentioned how the National Security Advisor of the day in 2015 was very involved in the vetting process, including being the lead on the ad hoc committee for appointing the Chief of Defense Staff. Can you just relay to committee and to Canadians why it's important to have the National Security Advisor vetting the Chief of Defense Staff when you look at the security clearances that are required, the physical evidence of misconduct that have to be looked at, whether it's going through everything from correspondence and pictures and financial transactions, you know, how those materials come into play in the appointment of the Chief of Defense Staff?
Thank the member for the question. Madam Chair, what I would say is, you know, obviously from the perspective of the ad hoc committee, I think it's clear that the presence of the clerk of the Privy Council and the National Security Advisor in the Privy Council on that committee, guiding that committee, I think speaks to the extreme high-level nature of the appointment. There are very few appointments that are more high-level and more important than appointing a Chief of the Defense Staff. And that's why there is such a direct connection between the most senior levels of the Privy Council office and the Prime Minister's office when assessing an appointment like this. Obviously, I can't speak to the interplay between the National Security Advisor and the department or the Canadian Armed Forces. I mean, clearly, given what's transpired, given the allegations made in hindsight, given the allegations made 6 years later, clearly we need significant cultural and structural change within the Canadian Armed Forces so that women in uniform are not only safe, but are empowered and enabled to come forward to trusted, independent investigative bodies.
How much time do I have left, Madam Chair?
You're just about done, Mr. Bazan.
Okay, just one quick question.
Okay.
Then, if I may, Mr. Novak, when you're looking at the national security clearances that the Chief of Defense Staff has, and when you look at the allegations that have been brought forward against the current and the former Chief of Defense Staffs, do you believe that their security is compromised, that they are now potentially at risk of, blackmail or other espionage from our adversaries?
Madam Chair, I think all I can say on that is that obviously when serious allegations are brought forward, and it seems they have been a number of years ago, that does raise troubling questions about who else might have those allegations and what interactions may or may not have existed with chiefs of defense staff. I think it's a good question. I'm not sure I'm well positioned to answer it, but I think it's a good question.
All right. Thank you very much. On to Mr. Biddle, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Novak, for appearing today and answering questions. I guess it's safe to say for the appointment to go forward, you didn't have any concerns based on the investigations that had happened. Is that a safe thing to say?
Madam Chair, I think I spoke very clearly to this in my statement. We were advised in
Mr. Novak,
in March
if
of
I can
2015.
interrupt, these are yes or no questions, and I don't have a lot of time, and I appreciate if you stick to it. So just to confirm, you didn't have any concerns, yes or no, after all of the investigations that you spoke about, you didn't have any concerns and recommended the appointment to go forward. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, if the member would let me finish, the ad hoc committee did report to us the matter
Madam
of
Chair,
the general's relationship in
if
Italy.
Mr. Novak can be directed to answer the
I'm
question.
attempting to answer the question, Madam Chair. The member doesn't seem to want to hear the answer.
Please.
In March of 2015.
Go ahead, Mr. Novak.
In March of 2015, we were advised of the matter of how General Vance met his then fiancée. As I indicated, we were told that the matter had been closed. There was no reprimand against the general. That's what we knew in March of 2015. The appointment was announced in April. I have briefed the committee on the rumor that was brought forward
Madam Chair,
in April.
Again, my question isn't being answered, Madam Chair, so if I can interrupt that aside, and I appreciate you answering that question. But in the end, in July, it is safe to say you did not have any concerns with General Vance in recommending the appointment. I'm not trying to trick you here. You recommended the appointment to the Prime Minister, I'm guessing. Is it true that you didn't have any concerns about the appointment?
Madam Chair, I think my actions demonstrated I took the rumor very seriously that was brought to me. I immediately, the same day, spoke to the National Security Advisor and asked for a review and investigation of that rumor. I think that demonstrates very clearly a high level of concern. At the same time, I've indicated to the committee
Novak,
that there were no
again,
facts
Mr. Novak,
briefed back to us by officials at the time.
Madam Chair, if I can.
Point of order, Madam Chair. Mr. Biddle is really badgering the witness here. We want to hear the answers, and his constant interruptions is not adding to the testimony in any way, shape, or form.
No one is answering my question. I've asked a simple question with respect to his thoughts in July. I'm not suggesting that he didn't have concerns based on previous evidence. I'm asking what his concerns were at the end of the investigative process in his mind, if he had concerns in recommending. And he hasn't answered the question, which is why I'm raising these concerns. And I've already lost a couple of minutes on a simple yes or no question. In July, before the General Vance took over as Chief of the Defense Staff, did you have concerns with his appointment?
I've been very clear about that, Madam Chair. When rumors were conveyed, took those very seriously, and I was concerned, and I wanted to receive from our officials the facts and whether there were any outstanding investigations or information that we were not aware of. And our officials reported back that there were not.
It's very weird how cagey you're being, Mr. Novak, about this. So you did have concerns still remaining in your mind on July 2015 after all of the investigations, or you were content with the appointment with General Vance?
Madam Chair, I appreciate the members trying to play have a bit of a partisan discussion about this. And I'm not before the committee in a partisan capacity. I've been very candid. I was concerned to receive a rumor about the appointment. I reported that immediately to the Privy Council and requested a further investigation. But Madam Chair, I mean, let's be candid. These appointments proceed on the basis of facts. When a rumor is reported to Privy Council and no information is returned, when an anonymous email is sent in and we are briefed, there's no new information, there's no investigation, the matter has been closed. Those are the facts that were available. Had there been other facts, another decision may have been made. There were not at the time, Madam Chair.
So based on the facts, you were content with the decision to appoint General Vance, which is why what I'm getting at, Mr. Novak, this isn't a partisan discussion. Based on the investigation by the Privy Council Office and all other agencies involved at the time, based on the information, which is the question I've been asking from the start, you were content and advised the Prime Minister, who was also content with the appointment of General Vance.
Very clear, Madam Chair. I don't know how to be more clear with the member that when rumors were raised, I was concerned. And that's why I asked for additional investigation and review from the officials responsible for running the process. I'm not sure how I could be more clear, Madam Chair, with the member.
Well, I think it would be clear to answer yes or no. I will move on, Mr. Novak, and I'm worried that this suggests that you still had concerns based on that, based on what was going on. I thought that would be a very easy answer to say investigations happened, they were independent and moved on. But I'd like to now focus in terms of what you said, that PCO was guiding the process. And you agree with me that that was fundamental, that you didn't want the appearance of impropriety by elected officials or PMO officials interfering in a investigation. You wanted this to be a clear process, especially based on the concerns that there was sexual misconduct.
I might ask the member to restate the question. Is this a question about the ad hoc committee process?
This is a question just in regards to the process of receiving complaints. It was important to you that PCO lead the investigation process because you didn't want to be seen to be interfering in an investigation that involved sexual misconduct or allegations of sexual misconduct.
Madam Chair, the member, I think, knows that the Prime Minister's office is not an investigative body and that senior officials in the Privy Council office are the ones responsible for interacting with the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Armed Forces with respect to this matter. And I think I've been very candid about what was known at the time. There was the matter of the general's time at NATO and the issue around how he met his wife, and there was the rumor that was relayed to us. I've been very candid. I think the member needs to be mindful of the fact that there are serious questions about how allegations have been dealt with in more recent years, and the fact that
Well,
2 years
Madam
later,
Chair,
I'm
if I can,
I'm
chief of
afraid,
defense
Mr.
staff
Biddle,
was still
Mr.
serving
Biddle,
the
I'm
government.
afraid your time is up.
well, it's disappointing that none of my questions have been answered, but I appreciate it and hope I have another opportunity, Madam
On
Chair.
to
Thank you.
Monsieur Barcelou-Duval, s'il vous plaît.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Novak, for witnessing before us today. I think that it's an important testimony because you have information about what happened in the past, and that may shed some light on what happened later with respect to the allegations. And this is something that we need to be concerned about. And so within my questions, I may interrupt you, but it's not against you, but it's really so that I'll be able to get a clear idea of the situation because we have limited time. I was wondering, Mr. Novak, I would imagine that you were aware of the testimony of Mr. Wellborn and Mr. Sajjan in the last couple of weeks. And Minister Sajjan, in his testimony, told the committee that it wasn't up to the Minister of Defense to act against allegations with respect to the higher offices in the military. I do agree with this.
On this, which I think is borne out by what I conveyed in my statement, is that when rumors or even allegations are made aware to the political level of government, I believe they have a responsibility to convey them to officials immediately and ensure that that information, whatever it may be, is pursued and is investigated, and if there are findings, that they be reported back to the political level of government for further decision if necessary. That's how I acted in 2015, and I believe that's entirely appropriate.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Novak.
Thank you very much, Mr. Novak. In his testimony, Mr. Wellborn mentioned that he would have liked to present evidence and that he also canceled all of his meetings, subsequent meetings with him. So do you think that if Minister Sajjan had been aware of the information that Mr. Wellborn wanted to present, he would have acted in an appropriate fashion with respect to the CDS?
Madam Chair, I obviously am not aware of what information was potentially offered to the minister. All I can say is that when I became aware of a rumor, I was concerned and immediately passed that information to senior officials and asked them to investigate. And I think that's appropriate. And I'm surprised that hasn't been done in later years.
Mais par exemple, si le
For example, if the ombudsman came to see you as the head of cabinet, and he said, I have documents that say that the CDS, there are allegations and there's evidence to the fact that there would have been inappropriate behavior with respect to members of the Canadian Armed Forces. Would you have recommended to the defense minister to meet with the ombudsman to be made aware of the information?
Madam Chair, in that situation, if I had been in my role as Chief of Staff of the Prime Minister and information was brought to me or allegations were brought to me, I would have acted exactly the same. I would have immediately conveyed that information to either the National Security Advisor or the Clerk of the Privy Council and requested an immediate investigation because that is how the system is structured. That is why senior officials are there. And I think it's the responsibility of the political level of government to ensure that information is passed to them, that investigations are undertaken, and if there are decisions required, then they are taken subsequent to that.
trouvez-vous ça normal qu'un chef?
Do you feel that it's normal that a Minister of Defense and the Ombudsman of the Canadian Armed Forces come forward and say that there's a problem with the CDS? This is not just anybody. It's not a lower rank. So he's probably really the highest rank in the army. Would it be normal that the Minister of National Defense says, I don't want to be aware of what's going on?
Madam Chair, I would concur with the member. I don't think it's normal or appropriate, particularly given the context, particularly given the issues that we're all aware of. Clearly, structural and cultural change is badly needed in the Canadian Armed Forces. And clearly, it's not acceptable that information, whether they be rumors or allegations, are not pursued immediately to the full extent, so that if change needs to be made, it is made promptly.
From your point of view, with the experience you have, would you be able to tell us why a Minister of the Defense would refuse to meet with the ombudsman and to be made aware of such important information?
Madam Chair, I'm afraid I can't explain why the minister would take that position. I've indicated that when I was in a position where rumors were shared with me, I immediately relayed them to the most senior officials in the government and requested an investigation. I can't explain the actions of others.
Pour sa défense,
For his defense, the Minister of Defense has said that he would prefer that he didn't want to interfere in any investigations and he didn't want to lead any investigations personally. From your point of view, do you think that becoming made aware of the information and asking questions of people who do have the information, would that be interfering with investigations?
Madam Chair, clearly I'm not a lawyer. What I would say, and as I have said, is political staff, ministers clearly aren't investigative entities in our system of government. However, I do believe they have a responsibility to relay information they may come across to the appropriate senior officials and ensure that that information is investigated and appropriate measures taken if necessary.
seriez-vous d'accord avec moi?
Would you agree with me that when important information is being reported to the Minister of Defense, for example, and that the minister refuses to be aware of that, not be aware of the knowledge, is that that so that he wouldn't have to justify himself if things went wrong? Is it a way that he could protect himself rather than making the right decisions, having the information in hand?
Madam Chair, I'm certainly not going to speculate on how or why the Minister of National Defense acted as he did. He can speak for himself. I know he's been put before the committee on a number of occasions. All I can say is that when serious information was relayed to me, when a rumor was relayed to me in 2015, my reaction to that was to pass that information to the most senior officials in the Privy Council and request an immediate investigation so that action could be taken if that investigation yielded any facts or information we were unaware of.
All right. Thank you. Merci beaucoup. On to Mr. Garrison, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I want to start by thanking Mr. Novak for his frank and comprehensive testimony today before the committee. I think it is quite helpful. I have some questions about the timelines and, again, the who knew what when question. So what you've told us this morning is that there was an initial, I guess, investigation into the allegations involving General Vance when he was at NATO. And it seems to be that those were dismissed on the basis that there was a consensual relationship. I don't know whether you ever saw the report, but it seems to me a bit strange that it's okay for a senior member of the military to make advances toward a more junior officer, providing that they're wanted, and that it doesn't indicate problematic behavior. Was that the sense of that report, or did you see that report?
Madam Chair, what I can share with the member is what officials in the Privy Council briefed us on, which was that while the general was deployed on the NATO mission, he was in a relationship with an officer who was subordinate to him, but not in the chain of command. That the review of that matter had not yielded any reprimand of the general. The investigation was closed, and we were told that the other officer involved was the general's fiance.
So really, ask you to draw this conclusion. I'm actually drawing a conclusion. Everybody's saying, well, General Vance was lucky in this case because the advances weren't unwanted. They would have been quite inappropriate had they been unwanted advances. So the subcommittee that you talked about, or the ad hoc committee, sorry, that looked at this, would have been aware of that initial investigation and that initial allegation of sexual misconduct in making their recommendation?
As Thank you, Madam Chair. As I mentioned in my statement, that in the process leading up to the appointment in April, the ad hoc committee's work had yielded this matter of the general's time at NATO. And we were briefed again by our officials on the fact that the general had been in a relationship that was with a subordinate officer, not in the chain of command, that there was no open investigation into the matter, that there'd been no reprimand of the general, and that by this time in 2015, when we're learning about this, that the general was engaged to the other officer.
And would the ad hoc committee been made available of the two new pieces of information that came forward in July? So that committee, which included the Minister of Defense, or were those dealt with just by the National Security Advisor rather than the ad hoc committee at that point?
Essentially, Madam Chair, essentially the same members of the ad hoc committee were aware of the two pieces of information that came forward in early July: the anonymous email that was received by someone at the department, and the rumor that was relayed to me that I reported to the National Security Advisor.
And what you've told us is that General Vance was asked directly about the Gagetown, well, let's call it a rumor at this point. I guess my question is, given the seriousness of the allegation, given it was the second or third allegation of sexual misconduct against a potential chief of defense staff, did anyone, since obviously you knew which officer was involved with General Vance, did anyone interview the victim in this case?
Madam Chair, as I said in my statement, let's be very clear on what was known at the time. In March of 2015, we were briefed on this matter of how the general came to meet his wife, his then fiance, excuse me, while on a NATO deployment. We were told that she was subordinate, not in the chain of command.
Sorry, I'm asking about the Gagetown.
I'll come to Gagetown. I just want to ensure we're not adding allegations that we were not aware of at the time. That's what we were aware of in March, the issue relating to NATO. In early July, before the change of command ceremony, the issue of the rumor is raised with me, and I reported to the National Security Advisor at that time. The rumor was, as I said earlier, that the general was was either in an inappropriate relationship some 15 years before, and or had interfered to further the career of an officer. That was the rumor. That's what was relayed to the National Security Advisor for investigation.
And did anyone interview the officer that Vance was allegedly involved with or had furthered the career of at this time? Because Vance said, according to your testimony, that he did have a public relationship with this person. So it was obviously known who we were talking about at this time.
Madam Chair, all I can say to the member is what I said in my statement. I relayed the rumor to the National Security Advisor. The National Security Advisor sometime later reported back that he had done two things. He had investigated that with the department, with the Canadian Armed Forces, found nothing, and had spoken to General Vance about it directly, who denied it.
And given the shortness of time, I'm going to go on to what records would have been kept of these investigations and these concerns that were raised. So would the Privy Council Office have had these on file? Would they be part of some kind of file about the Chief of Defense Staff and his appointment?
Madam Chair, there would have been memos related to the ad hoc committee process from the Privy Council during the course of February and March of 2015. As I stated, I don't have access to those records at this time.
Right. Thank you very much. On to Mr. Benson, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Novak, for appearing here today. Mr. Novak, I'd like to ask you a question. If the Minister of Defense was given evidence of a sexual misconduct, and he looked at that evidence, and he then wanted an investigation started, would that be interpreted as political interference?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but I think my actions speak to my views on this matter. When the political level of government, whether that is a senior staff member or a minister, comes across serious allegations, or frankly, even a rumor, I believe they have a responsibility to convey that information to the appropriate officials and insist on an investigation and insist on knowing the results and acting on facts or further information, if any is the result of that.
And, you know, and by the investigations that were done at your time, there was no evidence presented of a sexual misconduct against Mr. Vance that you refused to accept and investigate.
No, Madam Chair, I've been very clear. We were essentially aware of two different issues. One, the matter of the general's time when posted to NATO, which, as I mentioned in March of 2015, is conveyed to us that he had been in a relationship with an officer who was subordinate, not in the chain of command, and that there had been no reprimand against him following the review of the matter, and that by 2015 he was engaged to this individual. And in July, as I mentioned, we're made aware of a rumor that while at Gagetown, the allegation was he was in an inappropriate relationship and it was a rumor, that was not completely clear, or he had acted to improperly further someone's career. That's the rumor. Those are the two different issues we were aware of. And as I mentioned on the rumor, that was relayed to the NSA for investigation.
Okay, thank you. Clearly, the Prime Minister wanted to make a good selection when he was picking a Chief of Defense Staff. Can you talk a little bit about how many investigations the Conservative Party carried out? Can you talk about how many departments and agencies were involved and how in depth you went into this investigation to make the right choice or the choice that you made?
Thank you, Madam Chair. As indicated, we were briefed by the Privy Council that the NATO matter had been investigated by the NIS, by the department, by the Canadian Armed Forces. And I relayed to the committee what we were briefed in March of 2015, which was there had been no reprimand, there was no open investigation, and that the general had been in a relationship with a subordinate who wasn't in the chain of command. In July, as I indicated, the rumor that we picked up was relayed to the NSA, who investigated that matter, as he briefed us later, with the department, with the Canadian Armed Forces. Reported to us there was nothing in the files. There was no record of a complaint. There was no complainant. Separately from that, as I indicated at the outset, when an anonymous email was sent in to the department in July, this pertained to the NATO matter. We were briefed that there was nothing new in it. We were briefed that the receipt of the email caused the National Investigation Service to review the matter again, which they did, and we were briefed that the matter was later closed with no new finding.
Yeah, you were briefed on all these investigations that were going on as Chief of Staff.
Yes, Madam Chair. As I indicated in my statement, I was briefed in March on the NATO deployment issue, as I've described. And in July, I was the one who received the rumor, which I relayed to the National Security Advisor for investigation. And I was briefed by the National Security Advisor on the anonymous email that had been received pertaining to the NATO matter.
And based on what you know now and what you know then, I think you said today that you believe you were misled by General Vance in some of his answers and some of the stuff that he gave the committee. Is that true?
Madam Chair, as I said earlier, the Prime Minister met with General Vance it would have been towards the end of March of 2015. And in the course of that conversation, he asked him directly about the issue relating to his deployment at NATO, and recounted the information that had been provided to us by officials about that matter, which was that he'd been in a relationship with a subordinate, not in the chain of command, that we were not aware there had been any reprimand against him. The Prime Minister asked him directly whether there was anything else that he should know. And all I recall the general saying, as I indicated at the outset, was that he was glad the matter had been reviewed and was behind him. And that was it. And clearly, when we 6 years later have the very serious allegations brought forward by Major Brennan, If they are true, and as I said earlier, I have no reason to doubt her, that means that the general was not truthful when he met with the Prime Minister in March of 2015.
All right. Thank you very much. On to Monsieur Robillard, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Hello, Mr. Novak. Thank you very much for being here with us today. Mr. Novak, can you please tell us more about the appointment process for General Vance as Chief of Defense Staff?
Thank you, Madam Chair. As I indicated in my statement, there was an ad hoc committee constituted for the purpose of making a recommendation on this appointment. That's the same process that had been used for General Natinchuk and General Lawson. That committee was composed of the clerk of the Privy Council, the National Security Advisor, which is a senior position in the Privy Council, the Deputy Minister of National Defense, the Minister of National Defense. And as I indicated, the Prime Minister's office participated in that committee via the Deputy Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister. That committee, that ad hoc committee, I believe began its work sometime early in 2015. My understanding of the process is that the committee reviewed the senior ranks of the Canadian Armed Forces, consulted the existing Chief of Defense Staff for advice and others, and built a list of prospective candidates. Over time, that list was narrowed. The committee interviewed potential candidates, and eventually the committee's work concluded by providing a recommendation to the Prime Minister via the Privy Council.
Thank you, Mr. Novak.
How did the Prime Minister at the time, the Honourable Steve Harper, how did they conclude that the allegations against General Vance were not founded? What was the exact process that you did at the time?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've been very clear with the committee that in March of 2015, there was one issue raised. That was the issue pertaining to the general's deployment at NATO and how he met his, at that time, fiancée. That was the issue raised. That was in March of 2015. The appointment was announced in April of 2015. As I mentioned in my opening statement, in July of 2015, prior to the change of command ceremony, 2 additional pieces of information come forward. One, there's an anonymous email sent to someone at the Department of National Defense pertaining to the general's time at NATO. We were briefed by our officials that email was investigated by the National Investigation Service. They found nothing new that wasn't known in March, and that matter was closed. With respect to the rumor, as I indicated earlier, the rumor that I received was relayed to the National Security Advisor, who investigated it at our request and reported back sometime later that there was no record of a complaint, no complainant, no investigation that was either open or closed, and that he had directly spoken to General Vance about the matter, who denied improperly acting to further someone's career, and also indicated he had been in a public relationship with the individual during his time at Gagetown.
Alors, pourquoi avez-vous mis...
So, why did you stop the investigation with the NIS on General Vance?
Madam Chair, I'm not sure I understand the member's question. The Prime Minister's office didn't stop any investigation. The Prime Minister's office is not an investigative body. Our officials briefed us that with respect to the NATO deployment, that matter had been investigated by entities in the Canadian Armed Forces and at the department. Our officials briefed us in March that matter had been reviewed and the investigation was closed. There had been no reprimand of the general. When someone sends an anonymous email in later on in July, we are briefed that the email contains no new information, that the NIS had again reviewed it and had closed their review, finding nothing that was not already known. So I'm not sure I understand the member's question, Madam Chair.
Okay. Qui au sein du cabinet...
Who within the cabinet, the Prime Minister's cabinet at the time of the appointment of General Vance, who participated in the process for the appointment, and who would have participated in the verification of General Vance's history?
As I indicated in my statement, Madam Chair, the process, the ad hoc committee process, was led by the National Security Advisor, which is a senior position in the Privy Council, by the Clerk of the Privy Council, by the Deputy Minister of National Defence. The committee included the Minister of National Defence and the Deputy Chief of Staff in the Prime Minister's office. Those were the individuals involved in the ad hoc committee search process, Madam Chair.
Merci beaucoup. On to Monsieur Borselou-Duval, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you very much. We're on to Mr. Borselou-Duval. Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Novak, the minister spoke as though if he were to do anything, it would be interference. And so I have a few questions. An example, meeting with the ombudsman with the Canadian Armed Forces, or when it's the ombudsman that makes the request, would that be political interference?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't believe it would be. I cannot offer a legal perspective to the committee on this question. I think I've been very candid that when the political side of the government encounters allegations or even rumors, particularly pertaining to the head of the Canadian Armed Forces, that those should be reported for investigation.
Vous avez bien répondu à la question.
Thank you, Mr. Novak. You've answered the question. Also, if they decided to go ahead with an investigation with that with the information they had, would that have been interference?
Vous y avez demandé ou ordonné une enquête.
If they were to order an investigation.
I'm not sure I caught the full question, Madam Chair. I, again, don't believe it would be interference to pass information.
I will repeat my question. No, you did actually answer my question. Thank you. So on your side, from what I've understood, when you heard that there were rumors with respect to Mr. Vance, so you spoke to the PCO and to the PMO, so the information was passed on. So and do you feel that the same thing was done with Mr. Sajjan, that he informed the PCO, which would be normal? So the question I have, and maybe you can shed some light on this. He didn't want to become aware of it, but he did inform the PCO that there may be a problem, and the PCO, their reaction, rather than investigating on opening an investigation, they did an investigation on the victim. Do you think that is appropriate for the PCO to do that?
Madam Chair, clearly I'm not well positioned to comment on the actions of the Privy Council post 2015. All I can say is that in the case of the rumor that was relayed and at my request for an investigation in July of 2015, that was done, that this appointment would not have proceeded if that investigation had yielded any actual facts or any findings.
All right,
that's the purpose of relaying rumors for investigation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you very much. On to Mr. Garrison, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'd like to just return for a moment to where I left off when I ran out of time last time, and that is in terms of the records of these investigations. My question is fairly simple, Mr. Novak. Would, in the briefing of an incoming Prime Minister's staff, Chief of Staff or Deputy Chief of Staff, would information about the concerns regarding the appointment of Chief of Defence Staff been made available to the incoming Prime Minister's office, or would it have been available if they sought such information?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Obviously, I can't speak specifically to what briefings the incoming Prime Minister would have received. In my experience, those briefings are very thorough and very detailed. And obviously, I do believe if a Prime Minister or a Minister or a senior political staff member made inquiries of the Privy Council, I believe they would have the ability to find out information pertaining to the appointment that had been made.
Thank you very much. I just want to turn to the larger context, because I think what you've told us today is that there was a real incident focus in terms of the allegations and investigations. But let's look at the timeline of what was going on at the same time. So in March, when the allegations about General Vance and his NATO posting became public, Madame Deschamps was already investigating the problem of sexual misconduct in the military. And her report was released in April, saying sexual misconduct was a problem. There's a culture that tolerated it. So by the time you had two additional allegations in July against the Chief of Defence Staff, which would have been known both to senior staff in the Minister's office and the Prime Minister's office, and probably the Minister of Defense himself and the Prime Minister, did anyone look up from this incident-based focus and say, is this really the person we should be appointing as Chief of Defense Staff at this time, given multiple allegations of sexual misconduct in the face of the report that the government had just received from Madame Deschamps on sexualized culture in the Canadian military?
I'm sure I thank the member for the question. And yes, the external review was commenced under our government and did report that spring. That is exactly the case. Let's just be very clear about what information was available to us at the time. In March of 2015, we're aware of the matter of how the general met his future wife at NATO. I've spoken to that. Secondly, we're aware of a rumor that we ask officials to investigate. That was the only information at the time. What I don't mind saying for the member is obviously, looking back on this 6 years later, we have a range of very disturbing allegations that have been made. And when one makes an appointment to a position as senior as the Chief of Defense Staff, the head of the Canadian Armed Forces, one of the most historic and storied military institutions in the world, one is expecting that individual to uphold the proud record of that institution and leave it in a better place than he or she found it. And unfortunately, clearly that has not been the case.
All right. Thank you very much. On to Madame Gallant, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Would the Minister of National Defense, looking at defense of wrongdoing by a member of his own department, be considered political interference and negate the process?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, I can't bring a legal perspective to that answer, but I think it is not only appropriate, but essential that if the political level of the government, whether that be senior staff or the minister, receive information, rumors, allegations, that those be immediately shared and that investigations be pursued by the appropriate authorities.
You said you were briefed on the investigations against General Vance. As a Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, were you briefed on all investigations against senior government officials?
Thank you, Madam Chair. In the case of this appointment, I think I've been very candid about the information that I was aware of in the spring of 2015 as the ad hoc committee process unfolded. I don't recall being briefed on other allegations regarding senior officials at the time.
Okay. To your knowledge, the rumor you heard about a possible sexual misconduct allegation against General Vance in Gagetown, was that regarding Major Kelly Brennan, who came out publicly regarding the General Vance this year, or was it a different woman?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't recall hearing Major Brennan's name until recent weeks when she did the interview. That said, I cannot recall with certainty the name that was conveyed to us with that rumor 6 years ago, so I'm not completely sure.
At a time when you had allegations against General Vance from third parties, even without a complainant coming forward, even confidentially, you still opted to direct an investigation to be undertaken. Is that your testimony?
That's correct, Madam Chair. The rumor that we picked up in that was conveyed from the Chief of Staff to the Veterans Affairs Minister in July of 2015, that rumor was taken very seriously. And that's why I conveyed the rumor directly to the NSA, requested an investigation. And that's why we had internally agreed that this appointment would be deferred or canceled if necessary, if those investigations yielded additional information, which they did not.
Is it normal to give a $50,000 raise to the Chief of Defense Staff?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I, again, can't speak, obviously, specifically to the pay structure and the decisions made. I do note that the timing of that bonus is certainly troubling, given the other facts that seem to have been known at the time.
What other facts relating specifically to the allegations of sexual misconduct or something else?
I'm simply, Madam Chair, referring to media reports that in 2018 there were allegations that were brought forward that for whatever reason weren't investigated at the time.
Could there be any other reason for a pay raise of that significance to be given to an individual such as the CDS?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I won't speculate on why the pay raise decisions were taken. I think those questions are best directed to the government of the day.
How did you react to General Vance's role in the removal of Vice Admiral Norman?
Well, Madam Chair, I'm before the committee to discuss the appointment process for General Vance, so I'm not sure. I do have views on that. I'm just not sure it would be appropriate to get into them today.
Okay. Did any Chief of Defense Staff routinely socialize with Prime Minister Harper?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Not to my knowledge, no.
Okay. Was the previous Conservative government prepared to cancel his appointment as Chief of Defense Staff if the investigations concluded General Vance was guilty of an offense?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, absolutely. I am very confident in saying that if there had been additional information known, whether conveyed via that anonymous email or whether the investigation of the rumor had picked up any facts or anything else that needed to be investigated, I am very confident that change of command ceremony would have either been deferred or canceled.
Did you ask for briefings on the investigations that were being carried out?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, in the case of yes, absolutely. In the case of the rumor, I conveyed it to the senior officials in the Privy Council and asked that it be investigated. In case of the email that was received by someone at the department, it was our senior officials in the Privy Council who briefed us on it, who indicated to us that the receipt of the email had triggered the National Investigation Service to again review the matter. And then ultimately they reported back that review was closed and no further information was found.
All right, thank you very much. On to Madame Vandenbeld, please.
And I just want to say that this discussion we're having today, the reason this is so incredibly important is because when we look at the safety of women in the Canadian Armed Forces, women and men, it is really vital that we look at how people are promoted, how people are appointed, and what kind of qualities and traits are the things that are rewarded, what kinds of incentives, and what qualities and traits are overlooked as peripheral. And I think that what we're seeing systemically is that when there are accusations, allegations, rumors that have to do with sexual misconduct, that does not seem in history to have been something that that prevents people from being rewarded. And I think that is a fundamental thing we have to remember in the line of questioning that we're doing today. But first of all, I'd just like to ask you to confirm who appoints the Chief of Defense Staff. Is it a governor and council appointment?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Chief of Defense Staff is a GIC appointment. That is correct.
Perfect.
The appointment is made by the Governor General on the advice of the Prime Minister.
I just wanted to clarify because I think there was some confusion earlier. And I'd like to make sure that I'm getting your testimony exactly right. You mentioned that there were allegations or rumors that were brought to you after the initial part of the vetting process about an inappropriate relationship in Gagetown. So I'll note that that's not Naples, which was the relationship with his then fiancée, now wife, but in fact in Gagetown, which is consistent with what we have heard later from Major Brennan, and that this allegation came to you from the Chief of Staff of the then Minister of Veterans Affairs, and that would be Aaron O'Toole, who was then Minister of Veterans Affairs. And I understand the Chief of Staff is still his Chief of Staff today. So the person that alerted you to this was the Chief of Staff to the current Leader of the Opposition.
No, Madam Chair, that's not correct. The Chief of Staff to the Minister of Veterans Affairs at the time was a different individual.
Okay, no, I apologize for that, but that was Aaron O'Toole, who was the Minister of Veterans Affairs, and it was his most senior official that brought the allegations to you.
That's correct. Minister O'Toole was the minister at that time, and it was his Chief of Staff who conveyed the rumor to me.
Okay, and my understanding is that rumor, when you heard that, you then took that to the appropriate independent authorities, which was PCO. And I'd note the NSA is in PCO. So you took that to senior officials in PCO, asking them, and I'm paraphrasing a bit what you said, asking them to investigate this and report back, and that when nothing further was returned, there was nothing further to be done at that time. Is that correct?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not sure which part of the testimony the member is referring to, but if we're speaking about the rumor, correct. The rumor was conveyed to me. I asked the National Security Advisor and Privy Council to investigate the rumor immediately, which he undertook to do and did, and reported back to us as per my testimony.
So I guess what I would ask is, how is that different from when Minister Sajjan similarly heard, and we now know it was an email about inappropriate behavior from the media, but Minister Sajjan heard, again, an allegation from somebody who wanted to remain anonymous, and immediately within hours brought it to PMO and PCO and asked PCO to continue, because the investigation began with the Ombudsman, but to be in touch with the Ombudsman to continue that investigation. And when nothing further was coming, there was no copy of the email, no name of the person, no indication that the person wanted to go forward, and there was nothing further reported. Wouldn't that be the exact same process that you would have used? You have an allegation, you take it to PCO, you ask them to investigate, they get to a point where there's nothing further reported, and then they come back with the fact that there's nothing further to be done about it.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I obviously am not privy to all the details of who knows what in the current government between the minister and the Privy Council. All I can say is that in my case, when rumors were brought to me, I immediately conveyed them to officials, asked for an investigation, and ensured there was an outcome. And if there had been facts, then decisions would have been taken accordingly.
Okay, and I would note that in the case when Minister Sajjan was made aware of rumors, it was the very next day that PCO called in the former ombud and started and tried to do an investigation at that time. But what I would like to know, though, is it's one thing we've heard in this committee that it is really, really difficult. The system was not set up to deal with allegations against the highest ranking military official, the Chief of Defense Staff. But when you were dealing with this, he was not yet the Chief of Defense Staff. So similarly, you had rumors, you had one allegation that you had already known had been investigated. You had another one that came to you through the office of Aaron O'Toole, the Minister of Veterans Affairs at the time. Is this not, what is the threshold? And again, I go back to my initial statement that what kind of things are rewarded and what kind of behaviors are seen as not relevant or peripheral when you're making this kind of very important appointment. Why at that time did that not give you pause? Because I think the threshold when appointing someone is very different than a threshold once they're there. You have to have a reason to be able to then remove them. But when you're vetting somebody, you don't, this would have been enough reason. Is that not, if not you, was there anybody else on the political side, the minister, the prime minister, who raised concerns that maybe this wasn't the most appropriate person in terms of even just the questions being raised?
Madam Chair, I've been very candid on what information was known. I've been very candid that the prime minister directly asked General Vance in March of 2015 about the issue from the NATO deployment relating to how he met his wife. And I've been very candid on what his answer was to that. With regards to the rumor was relayed to officials. We asked for an investigation. They reported back that there were no facts. I think, the real challenge at the heart of this, Madam Chair, is if there had been other facts or other information, then another decision would clearly have been taken. And really underlying all of that, I think as the committee has been deliberating for weeks, is how do we achieve cultural and structural change in the Canadian Armed Forces to not only keep our women uniforms safe, but ensure that they are empowered to bring forward allegations for independent investigative review.
Thank you very much. On to Madame Elleslev, please.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you for this this excellent testimony today. My first question is, if I could just go back to the allegations and rumors around Gagetown, and you said that you acted to have them investigated. Did you also make the Minister of National Defense aware of these rumors? Was he aware of the rumors?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I believe that in early July, when the rumor was received and conveyed to the National Security Advisor for investigation, there was, in the days thereafter, a discussion about the need potentially to defer or cancel the change of command ceremony. And in that context, there was a discussion between the Prime Minister's office, the Privy Council office, and the Minister of National Defence's office.
And in your opinion, under the National Defense Act, is the Minister of National Defense legally accountable for the direction and management of the Canadian Forces?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I can't give the committee a legal perspective on that. That is my understanding. But again, I can't give the committee a legal opinion on that.
Fair enough, but that's how you were operating, as if it was his responsibility. And so then in that light, would you consider that there is a somewhat different process for vetting a potential candidate for Chief of the Defense Staff and an actual sitting Chief of the Defense Staff who does report directly to the Minister of National Defense?
Yes, the committee process that we used for appointing 3 chiefs of defense staff, I obviously can't speak to the one used by the current government, was, as I described, it's an ad hoc committee constituted for the purpose, composed of the most senior officials in the government of Canada, which I think clearly speaks to the importance of the appointment.
And your responsibility was obviously a very important one. Had the allegations been made around a sitting Chief of the Defense Staff and the Minister of National Defense had brought this to your attention, would you have advised conducting an investigation?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, absolutely. I think it is incumbent on the political leadership of the government, if they are made aware of whether they're rumors or serious allegations regarding the comportment of a senior official, especially someone who is leading the Canadian Armed Forces, that the government insists that matter be immediately investigated and appropriate action taken if necessary.
And would it have been your advice to suspend the individual during the course of that investigation, considering his serious and important position?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it's entirely dependent on the exact nature of the allegations, the context. I'm not sure I can speak to that. I think the important point for the committee to deliberate on is that if allegations, whether they be rumors or allegations or complaints, if they're raised to the political level of the government, that they be immediately reported to responsible officials and that there be an investigation. And if there are facts or outcomes from that investigation, that action is taken immediately.
And for the minister to have required an investigation and wanted the results to be reported back to him, would that have been viewed in your mind as political interference or him doing the job that he is responsible to the Canadian public to do?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't view that as political interference. I think particularly given the very serious nature of this topic, given the very disturbing allegations that we've all seen in a range of recent interviews, I think that any allegations or even rumors relating to these matters, I think it is essential they be reported to the appropriate officials and that immediate action is taken if the facts warrant the taking of action.
And knowing what you know now, do you regret the appointment of the General Vance as Chief of the Defense Staff?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think, as I watched, let me give the example of watching Lieutenant Colonel Eleanor Taylor's interview recently. I was absolutely struck by what our country has lost. In her case, a highly capable, decorated officer, the first Canadian woman to, as I understand it, lead troops into combat. She has now resigned in disgust and left the forces. And potentially we have an entire generation of young Canadian women who may have taken their skills into the Canadian Armed Forces to protect our country. And now they may be looking elsewhere thanks to what's gone on. And as I said earlier, when one appoints a Chief of the Defense Staff, one is seeking a leader who will uphold the finest traditions of that institution and leave it in a better place than he found it. And clearly that has not been the case. And I think the current government might say that also about their own recent appointment of a Chief of Defense Staff who only served a number of weeks.
All right. Thank you very much. On to Mr. Baker,
Thank you.
please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Mr. Novak, I'd like to go back to or confirm some information, if I may, and then ask you a question. My understanding is that the Chief of Staff to the Veterans Affairs Minister brought forward rumors and that those were shared with the office for officials for investigation. Is that correct?
That's correct, Madam Chair. In July of 2015, the Chief of Staff to the Veterans Affairs Minister relayed a rumor to me, which I immediately reported to the National Security Advisor in the Privy Council and asked him to investigate.
Could you explain for us why you shared it with the Privy Council for investigation?
Because, Madam Chair, I think as we've discussed, the Prime Minister's office is not an investigative body. The Prime Minister's office acts and interacts with the rest of government through the Privy Council office. The National Security Advisor, as I've described, was operationally had led the ad hoc committee process that vetted candidates for the Chief of Defense Staff. And so when it comes to a rumor of this nature, reporting it to the National Security Advisor was the appropriate action for the Prime Minister's office to take. And that individual was the one who I asked to investigate and report back to the Prime Minister's office.
Could you explain why? Is there a reason why you did you consider sharing it with the Minister of National Defense for investigation at the time?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, the Minister's office was absolutely made aware of both the rumor and the anonymous email, as I described in my testimony. In this case, the Prime Minister's office operates through the Privy Council office, and that is why I asked the National Security Advisor to investigate that rumor. And the results of his investigation were briefed back to us, as I indicated to the committee.
But is there a reason you didn't have the Minister of National Defense investigate?
Madam Chair, the Minister of National Defense, through his Chief of Staff and his office, was absolutely aware of this and briefed on the results of the National Security Advisor's investigation. And as I indicated in my testimony, the NSA had spoken, had interacted with the department, with the Canadian Armed Forces, and had spoken with the general himself, and then reported the results of that investigation back to the PMO.
So what I'm hearing you say is that the Minister of National Defense was briefed, but was not asked or to at any point to lead an investigation or encouraged to lead an investigation. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, it was the NSA who was asked to lead the investigation. The Minister's office was absolutely aware of it. The officials that the NSA was interacting with certainly would have been available to the Minister. If there were conversations there, I'm unaware. But it was the NSA, again, one of the most senior officials in the Government of Canada, who led the investigation into the rumor that was relayed to us.
Okay. And is there a reason that it wasn't given to the Minister of National Defense for investigation? Like why were the actions that you took to have this issue investigated the appropriate actions? And why not sent to the Minister of Defense?
Because, Madam Chair, that political staff and ministers don't personally lead investigations. Their responsibility is to take information, provide it to their officials, ensure the officials are investigating, and ensure if there are facts or results of the investigation that immediate action is taken.
And could you explain why that is? Like, why is it that political ministers or political staff should not be driving investigations or leading investigations?
Well, Madam Chair, I think this goes to the structure of our system of government. We rely on our senior officials to undertake investigations of this matter. And I don't think any of us believe that the solution to the problems we've all seen in recent months is to empower political staff to start doing their own investigations. I think the issue here is making sure information is provided to the responsible officials for investigation, and frankly, underlying that, making sure we achieve cultural and structural change in the Canadian Armed Forces so that women are not only safe, but empowered to bring forward allegations for independent investigation.
So what I hear you saying, Mr. Novak, is that when an allegation is brought forward about impropriety, sexual assault, sexual harassment, or something of that nature, that it should be brought in against the Chief of Defense Staff, that should be brought to Privy Council's office for investigation. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, as I said in my testimony, in the case of the rumor I received in July 2015, I brought that immediately to the National Security Advisor. I believe that's the appropriate process. Certainly in the case I was dealing with, the NSA had been operationally leading the ad hoc committee process, selecting and making recommendations for the selection of the Chief of Defense Staff. And I think that's the appropriate process in that case, is to bring whatever information is received to the responsible officials, ask for an investigation, and act if necessary.
All right, thank
Chair,
you
how much
very
time?
much.
Okay.
On to
Thank you.
Monsieur Barcelou-Duval, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Novak, if you were made aware as a minister, such as what we've heard, with respect to serious sexual allegations with respect to the CDS, you said earlier that you thought that an investigation would be the least of the things that should be moved ahead with. So that the fact that the Minister of Defense saw things differently. So he decided to look aside, to look away. And in your opinion, do you think that this is a lack of courage, or worse, this is a voluntary neglect?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm not going to speculate on how or why the current minister has handled this matter. All I can speak to is how I handled a rumor, as I have the rumor that was brought to me in July of 2015, and I think it's entirely not only appropriate but essential that if that kind of information, whether it's a rumor or an allegation, be immediately relayed to the responsible officials for investigation, and if there are facts coming out of that investigation, that appropriate remedial action is taken immediately.
En tout cas, moi, je peux me permettre de partager mon opinion.
Well, I'd like to share my opinion. I think that this was voluntary blindness and a lack of courage on the part of the minister. So if a woman were a victim of sexual assault or other sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces, and if they know that the CDS has acted in such a way, I think that, and that the Minister of Defense decided not to do anything about it, well, I would be really discouraged. So do you think that the actions of the minister are contributing to amplify the problem, the culture problem that exists within the armed forces, and that it may lead women that are members to lack confidence in the system?
Madam Chair, I think it's up to the current government to speak to the facts of the matter. I think it's up to them to explain why General Vance served so many years as he did, even if there were questions or allegations being asked. All I can convey to the committee is what was known at the time of the appointment in 2015, which I think I've spoken very candidly to.
Right, thank you very much. On to Mr. Garrison, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I just want to clarify a point. I'm not asking for legal advice, Mr. Novak, but certainly Chief of Defense staff serve at the pleasure of government. Is that not correct? Because there was a member implying that would need to be some reason to remove a Chief of Defense staff. If they serve at pleasure, could not the government decide a new Chief of Defense staff could have been necessary at any time?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I believe the member is correct. This is an at-pleasure appointment. I believe it can be changed at any time.
And while you were in the Prime Minister's office, you've referred to 3 times the Chief of Defense staff changed. There were new appointments. Was this because it was the normal practice for them to serve a term and then have a new Chief of Defense staff? In other words, is what happened with General Vance unusual in being extended as the Chief of Defense staff?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't believe there's a set term. I think if the member reviews the history of the duration of incumbents in the position, that generally speaking, it seems to be 2 or 3, sometimes 4 years. But clearly, there is no set term. I can't speak to why the current government made the decision that it did with respect to General Vance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Novak. It seems, as we're probably coming to the end of some of our time here, what we learned today is that Prime Minister Harper and the Defense Minister Kenney knew about allegations of sexual misconduct against General Vance before he was appointed. And of course, we already knew that the Minister of Defense knew at the time of his extension, and probably Prime Minister Trudeau. Why, when there are so many other senior officers of distinction in the Canadian Armed Forces, why do you think that Vance, the appointment of Vance proceeded? Weren't there other possible appointments that could have been made who would have better fit the needs of the Canadian Forces at that time? And maybe I'm asking you in retrospect, but it certainly seems true to me that there were other better appointments that could have been made.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think in hindsight, knowing what we know now 6 years later, particularly with the allegations that we've all seen, very disturbing allegations, I think that's a fair question. At the time, I can't speak to the committee's deliberation on other candidates. I have shared very candidly with the committee the issue that was known in March, which was related to the general's deployment in Italy and how he met his wife. Spoken very candidly to the rumor that we received in July. That was the information that was available to everyone at that time.
All right, thank you very much. On to Mr. Bazan, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and again, thank you, Mr. Novak, for your candor today. Interesting thing in your testimony today and the questions that's followed is that when a chief of staff to a minister received an allegation and a rumor, they reported it directly to you. Is it normal practice for chiefs of staff to ministers to report to the Prime Minister's chief of staff?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Certainly, I think in the case of something as serious as a rumor pertaining to the chief of defense staff, I think it's entirely appropriate and expected that a chief of staff to a minister, or frankly any political staffer in the government, would undertake to relay that forward to ensure that it was investigated and reviewed.
When you received this rumor from the second one about Gagetown, did you share that information with Prime Minister Harper at that time?
Thank you, Madam Chair. As I indicated, when I received the rumor, immediately relayed that information to the National Security Advisor and asked for an investigation. The Prime Minister was briefed on as was the Prime Minister's office, briefed on the results of that investigation sometime after that.
So any responsible government, you would think that the chief of staff would have briefed the Prime Minister, including Prime Minister Trudeau, be getting briefed by Katie Telford. Don't expect an answer on that. Again, coming back to the evidence that was presented to Minister Sagen and him pushing away and refusing that evidence, wouldn't it have been more responsible to have accepted that evidence and shared it with the appropriate authorities like the National Security Advisor rather than saying this argument that it was political interference?
Thank you, Madam Chair. All I can say to the member, I assure you, Madam Chair, I've never told someone I don't want to hear it when it comes to a rumor or an allegation of serious misconduct or harassment or anything else. And I think how this rumor was handled in July of 2015 is entirely appropriate in relaying it to senior officials and asking them to investigate.
Yeah, I think it's very unfortunate that information wasn't gathered at that time by Minister Sagen and shared with the National Security Advisor. Can you dive deeper why the National Security Advisor is such an important person within the Privy Council office and why it's important that they are the lead on vetting someone like a Chief of Defense Staff?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The National Security Advisor, as I spoke to earlier, is, again, one of the most senior public servants in the country. It's a position that, as Chief of Staff of the Prime Minister, I interacted with the NSA daily, sometimes multiple times a day. It's an individual who, in my experience in government, is briefing the Prime Minister often daily, at least a few times a week on matters of national security. It's a key position in the Privy Council in our system of government. And when it comes to the selection process for a Chief of Defense Staff, operationally, that individual, the NSA, is a key member of that process who in fact led that process. And when there are issues or concerns, that he is the responsible individual in the Privy Council office who would then, working with the Canadian Armed Forces senior members, working with the department, who would then access those other bodies and ensure that investigations were carried out and report the findings back to the Prime Minister's office and the Prime Minister for any action that was necessary.
So in the situation, if the NSA had come back on General Vance with more substantive allegations of sexual misconduct, there's no question in your mind that you would have stopped that the government, they would have stopped the appointment as General Vance as CDS?
Thank you, Madam Chair. As I've said, in July of 2015, if either the anonymous email that was received or the rumor that I received that I asked the NSA to investigate, if either of those two issues had yielded additional facts or frankly any additional questions or avenues that needed to be pursued or open investigations, I am very confident in saying that that appointment would not have proceeded at that time.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Right, thank you. On to Mr. Baker, please. These are the last 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Novak, I wanted to circle back to the line of discussion that we were having when I last asked questions in the last round. We spoke about the fact that the Chief of Staff to the Veterans Affairs Minister brought forward rumors and that those rumors were shared with officials for investigation. Then is it fair to assume then that the minister would have known about those rumors?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I believe the minister did know about those rumors. And I've been very candid that it was his chief of staff who relayed them to me, as I would expect. And I asked for them to be investigated immediately by the National Security Advisor.
Okay, thank you. And you spoke earlier in your discussion with me about the fact that investigations should not be led by political officers or politicians, that they should be led by the appropriate people, in this case, an investigative service. Can you explain why that is? Why is it important that it be led by an investigative service?
Well, Madam Chair, I think it's abundantly clear that political offices, political staff are not equipped, and it'd be entirely inappropriate to have the political organs of the government leading investigations. I think, as we discussed, in our system, what is necessary and appropriate is for any information that anyone acquires be relayed to the responsible officials for full investigation and ensure that those investigations are pursued. And if there is information, facts, or otherwise that requires remedial action, that action is taken immediately.
Thank you. And Mr. Novak, just for people who are watching this hearing who maybe aren't as familiar with the specifics as to how government operates or how investigations are run, what is it about the investigative services that makes them, in your view, the appropriate place for allegations like this to be brought and investigated?
Well, Madam Chair, the perspective I can offer on that is from someone who spent 10 years in the Prime Minister's office. Clearly, political staff are not equipped, trained, or appropriate for these kinds of investigations. That's why we have senior officials. That's why we have structures in the Canadian Armed Forces and in the department. Candidly, clearly, given the allegations we've all witnessed in recent weeks, there is a very real question about the culture and the structure in the Canadian Armed Forces that seems not to empower and enable women to come forward to have allegations investigated by appropriate independent authorities.
Okay, and how did the Prime Minister Harper, yourself, his office, conclude that the allegations brought against Mr. Vance were unfounded?
I'm sure I've been very clear in my testimony that in March of 2015, we're briefed by officials about the matter pertaining to the general's time at NATO, that he had been in a relationship with someone who was subordinate, not in the chain of command, and that he was at that time engaged to that individual. The appointment was announced some weeks after that. In July of 2015, we're advised of an anonymous email. We're told it contains no new information and that the investigation into the email is closed. And we're provided with a rumor that we have investigated by our officials who brief us that there's no complainant, nothing in DND's files, and that the general denies the rumor. That's the information that was available to us at the time, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair, how much time do I have?
Half a minute.
Okay, just a brief question. At any point during in your time, in your role with Prime Minister Harper, did you ever share the allegations or any concerns you had about General Vance and in terms of these allegations with anyone else, anyone taking up a position in office subsequent to yourself or to a subsequent team?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The only allegations I'm aware of are the ones that I've spoken about. The issue related to how the general met his wife, and the rumor that was passed to me in July of 2015 that I asked the Privy Council to investigate. It's the only allegations I'm aware of. They were discussed, as I indicated, to the member and to the committee with the Privy Council office at the time. and with the Minister of National Defense's office at the time.
And no
All
one else.
right. That I'm afraid time
that
is
right?
up. And I'd like to thank you, Mr. Novak, for joining us today. I'm sorry that it was so early out in Vancouver, but we're probably all jealous of the lovely springtime you're way ahead of us. But thank you for joining us today. I thought you brought a lot to our discussions. So we'll sign you off for now, and thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I know you also served in uniform, and I thank you for that, and I appreciate the opportunity today.
Thank you. All right.
Madam Chair, you want to deal first
Yes.
with the
Yes. Would you like
safe
to
subcommittee report?
Yes. Thank you, everyone. You all got a copy of it. It really deals with the scope and what we're going to work on for the military justice survey. Is everyone all right with it, or do you want to read or review or debate it, or are you good to say it's good to go? Good to go? Good to go? Okay. Anyone know? All right. So, does the committee wish to adopt a report? All those against say so or forever hold your peace. All right, thank you. If carried. Okay, that's excellent. Okay. So
Madam
one
Chair?
piece it's been hanging around for a while, so we really needed to get it so we can move ahead preparing for the next study. Go ahead, Mr. Bazan.
Right, Madam Chair, and I think that at some point in time over the next week or two, be good to have a subcommittee to just organize the work of committee,
Yep.
knowing that we have 2 reports that have been drafted, as well as a new another study that we want to get underway while we're still dealing with the study on sexual misconduct in the armed forces. Based upon the evidence that we received today, I move the following: that the Standing Committee on National Defense, concerning its study on addressing sexual misconduct issues in the Canadian Armed Forces, including the allegations against former Chief of Defence Staff Jonathan Vance and Admiral Art MacDonald, that we invite the following witness, Daniel Jean, former National Security Advisor, and that he appear for 2 hours, and that the meetings be held in public and be televised. I think, if to speak to that motion, I think based upon what we heard now and how important the role the National Security Advisor played in the original screening and vetting of General Vance back in 2015, as well as the role that the National Security Advisors played, as Mr. Novak said, in the appointment process of General Natinchuk and General Lawson, I think that it is crucial that we have Daniel Jean appear, who was the National Security Advisor at the time these allegations were presented to the Minister of Defense in March of 2018.
Okay, we have Madame Vandenbelt and then Mr. Baker, please.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. And I know there was a notice of motion for a different witness. The member, Mr. Bazan,
I'll get to that, don't worry.
Okay. Well, Mr. Bazan just mentioned that perhaps there should be a steering committee meeting to look at what the further studies should be. I would imagine also what further witnesses, if any. I think that having heard the testimony today, I can think of a few people that were mentioned today that probably might be invited as witnesses too. I didn't come prepared today to put those names. So I think what we could do, Madam Chair, is I know we have our witnesses for Friday. You mentioned this morning, and since there was a motion saying 2 maximum in 2 hours, that would fill up Friday. I know we have two constituency weeks coming up after that. So I would imagine there would be plenty of time for the steering committee to sit down, look at all the different names, maybe some that other members are also interested in bringing, and then at that time see whether or not it's necessary to pursue this study further, or it's also possible to do more panelists per meeting. I think the steering committee could then report back to us on that. I also would just like to say that given everything that's happened, I'm very eager to get started on the military justice study. I think if we look at what survivors are saying right now, there is a lot of question about the military justice system, its ability to be able to look at things like criminal sexual assault and other things. And I think that's a very important study. Obviously, if we are to continue further with this study, I think we had said 4 meetings. We've already done 1 or 2, I believe. You can correct me if I'm wrong, Madam Chair. We have 1 on Friday. So I think that it would be good for the steering committee to get together and discuss exactly how many days are left, how much time we want to spend on different studies, what witnesses we want to bring. Again, if we're going to be starting to add witnesses ad hoc, one by one, in individual meetings like this, in this particular one, I see that there was no notice given. I just think that that's not the best practice to be able to just say this witness, that witness, and then at the end of the day, those of us who, I think we need to look at the testimony today and other testimony and see who might be better people to be able to bring in. So my preference, Madam Chair, would be that we would not vote on individual witnesses one by one. I've said this in this committee many times, but instead that we would have a steering committee meeting and have all of the witnesses discussed there.
All right, Mr. Baker, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So, I want to kind of come back to what I think I think we should be focusing on as a committee, and we've heard it from a number of of those folks who've presented to us and the other witnesses, which is the issue of how we address the issue of the problem with the culture, and ultimately to eliminate sexual harassment and assault in the Canadian forces. That would be my preferred focus for our team. I think that that is the best way to do justice by the victims, by the survivors, and when I think about where the focus is right now, we're still focused far too much, in my view, on things that don't help us resolve that question or those questions and make recommendations to government that allow us to do that. So my strong preference would be that we focus our attention on those issues, and focus on either hearing from folks who we think can complete our knowledge of why this happens, how it gets resolved. That to me would be a much better use of the committee's time rather than further going down this path. I just think we owe it to the survivors to focus there. So I would ask the committee members to consider that.
Okay, then Mr. Spengeman, Mr. Bazan, and then Mr. Robillard.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. I just wanted to echo the comments of my colleagues, Ms. Vandenbelt and Mr. Baker, with respect to the committee really finding traction now on a constructive way forward. I think we've heard from a range of witnesses, and the most recent witness just now echoed the importance of having a serious look at the structural and cultural changes that are required. I think we're coming to an area of agreement with respect to how the accountabilities flow, the fact that it is not proper for a minister or a prime minister to launch an investigation. Mr. Novak was very clear in his testimony on that, but he is also equally clear, as have been other witnesses, and I think the committee as a whole, that front and center in this inquiry needs to be the well-being of members of the Canadian Armed Forces, including most prominently women who have had the courage to come forward, but equally women and men who have not had the courage to come forward for reasons relating to the culture that's been described, the levels of seniority involved. There really is some important work that's ahead of us as parliamentarians beyond it, in addition to the question of what happened with this current Chief of Defence or former Chief of Defence staff. I think that's what we should focus on. I think your suggestion to use the subcommittee on a discussion of witness names as they come forward through these conversations is important. Equally, to coordinate the committee's work with respect to crossovers and linkages to the military justice study, I think that's very important. If we're looking to deal with systemic change, we need to look at our studies systemically and connect those thoughts to other areas of inquiry to make sure that we really get to those hurdles with respect to culture that stand in the way and have, by all accounts, stood in the way, at least since the ERA in 2015 that the previous
this witness just described, if not for a long time before then. So we've got some urgent work ahead and really need to focus on the substance of overcoming these obstacles.
All right, thank you. Mr. Bazin, then Mr. Robillard, then Monsieur Barcelou-Duval.
Well, Madam Chair, I understand why Liberal members are very uncomfortable with continuing on with the study, but we owe it to the Canadian Armed Forces, and especially the women who serve us, in getting to the bottom of what's happened. And we just had new revelation today about the role of the National Security Advisor. To not call a National Security Advisor at the time would be a misjustice on our part and a missed opportunity to get more information and details on how that investigation took place. Now, Madam Chair, you know, we've heard the minister say on multiple occasions that he handed this off to the proper authorities, and the PCO, as we've heard from Liberal members, was the proper authority. So let's talk to the person in the PCO that would have been in charge of the investigation, which is the National Security Advisor. To do otherwise on our part would be short-sighted. So, Madam Chair, I know that the Liberals are going to want to continue to talk this out and filibuster, but I can tell you that I'm prepared to stay and debate this and other motions as we go forward. So I'd just say that this is you know, aside from the fact that we need to have a steering committee to look at our total overall business, it is in order to suggest witnesses after hearing testimony, and I think based upon testimony we heard today, the role of the National Security Advisor, and in particular the former NSA Daniel Jean, is a person of interest that this committee must hear from.
Thank you, Mr. Ben. Monsieur Robillard, s'il vous plaît.
Madam Chair,
Madam Chair.
will be the last week that we have with our constituents. I would suggest that we have a little bit of time for our business in our writings. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Monsieur Barcelou-Duval, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Listen, I see that time is going by, and members of the committee have a lot to say about the motion, but I would like to let you know my concern with respect to what has been said by my colleagues, especially from the government party, with respect to the wanting to shorten the study that has barely begun. So this is a subject that's very important. We're talking about allegations for the current and the former CDS. So I think this is very serious. We need to look into it deeply. I think it's important to listen to all of the witnesses that will have relevant things to say. And I think that I understand that they want to have the committee meet, but I don't see why that would stop us from adopting the motion today. Because it's important that we're able to organize, and that would take a few moments to adopt a motion, and we can move on to other things. And I think that there may be other witnesses that may be just as interesting for us to hear in the context of this study.
Then Mr. Bagnall.
Madam Chair, I was concerned about what Mr. Robillard said.
Thank you. That was me. You called.
Stating that we only had one more week left with our constituents. Now, I thought that we had 2 weeks coming up, and why would he say that we only had 1 week? Is the Prime Minister planning on calling an election?
Madame Gallant. All right. On to Mr. Bagnall, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to echo what Mr. Baker said. I think, and the witness, this is a huge, terrible problem actually in the military, and there's thousands of people that have been affected, not just the several we've talked about so far. And I think those people serving in the military right now would want us really to get on with what Mr. Baker was saying, deal with the structural problems, the independence of the process, and the culture. And this is no small task. And I think we really have to address it and get onto it. And I think everyone on the committee is committed to solving that problem military-wide, so that people no longer fear, men and women, have any fear of serving in Canadian military, which is a very proud career. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Baker, please.
Thanks, Chair. I think there's no question that what we've been studying is important, and I you're not going to hear me say it's not. I think what I think is important to for me to qualify is that what to me is even more important is, and that we spend a proportionate and amount of time of this committee dealing with, when I say proportionate, I don't mean equal, I mean proportionate, dealing with the problem that's before us. Like, people are, unfortunately, we know that there are hundreds, thousands, we don't know exactly how many, but we know there are many, many victims. We know that, we've had witnesses come forward and talk to us about the problems of culture in the Canadian Armed Forces. And I think that these are issues that are really complex and require the time to study them. And there's a great urgency to do that, because if we do that, and if we do it effectively and quickly, then the sooner we can tackle it, and the sooner we tackle it, the sooner we're reducing the number of people and hopefully someday eliminating the people who are being victimized. And so I guess what I'm just saying is, I think we've spent a significant amount of time investigating the events around General Vance. And I'm not diminishing the importance of that, but what I'm saying is that what to me is the most important and should remain paramount is the people who've suffered and who are suffering right now. And I think that we should apply proportionate time and energy to solving that problem, which is the one before us, which is the one before government, which is the one before the Canadian Armed Forces. That is critical. And I think when I think about the lives that are being, we have to, I think it's important to remember too that, I think people who've been victims, members of the forces who've been victims, are watching this, they're following this. And I gotta, I think about what they're thinking as they're watching this, right? And they're watching, us as elected officials spend a lot of time on the circumstances that we've focused around. And again, I'm not diminishing the importance of that, but I think what they would want if they were here would be for us to tackle the underlying issue that's made them victims, that's in some cases destroyed lives. And so I would just suggest that we dedicate a proportionate amount of time to the problem that is before us, that is touching lives today. And to me, that means moving to a phase where we're calling witnesses and we're focusing on finding the best solution so we can actually shape the outcome. It's not good enough for us to, as politicians, it's inappropriate in my view, or it's not appropriate for us to sit here in this committee and criticize whoever we want to criticize for they didn't do this and they didn't do that. Let's talk about what we are going to do. Like, let's start talking about solutions. Let's start understanding the problem. We've started a little bit. It's a complex problem. Perhaps there's more understanding that's needed. And then let's tackle it. That to me is what we should be doing. And I think if I think about the people who've suffered, the people who've been victims, and if they're watching this at home, I'm confident that that's what they would like us to apply our time. So I'm urging us as people who are focused on making the lives of people better to focus our energies there. That's why I suggest that, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you. So, Madame Alislev, then I lost my sign, and then Monsieur Barcelou-Duval, and then Mr. Spengeman. Okay, go ahead, Madame Alislev.
Well, thank you very much. And I think we need to be conscious of the fact that there is a status of women study as well. And I think that there are two very different objectives, both that parliamentarians need to achieve. This committee, National Defense Committee, in my opinion, needs to be looking at holding the government and therefore the processes and what happened and how to account. We can't fix something if we don't fully appreciate all the places where it fell down or the ball was dropped. So we absolutely need to continue to hear from the National Security Advisor, to hear from Zita Astravas and Elder Marquez, and others that we uncover who should have been involved in the process and weren't, or who were and didn't behave in accordance with the roles and responsibilities that they're entrusted with in that process. The Status of Women Committee should be looking at what we need to change structurally, organizationally, and how we measure that. Ultimately, the victims, and I've heard from a number of them in the military and women in general in the military, want, yes, to know that these types of things will be prevented in the future, but they also do need to know that all of those senior officers and anyone who is involved in sexual misconduct is held accountable for their behavior, and whether they were complicit through their silence or their actions, that there is a process by which they will be held accountable. And I think that's part of the role and responsibility that we on this committee need to fulfill. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Monsieur Barcelou-Duval, s'il vous plaît.
Yes, Madam.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, what I've understood from my colleagues, especially from the Liberal Party, is that their intention is not to debate the motion that's been presented, but it's to shut down the study that has just been taken up on the subject. So they don't want us to really talk about this issue, which is nonetheless a very important, the most important issue when we look at the CDS of the Canadian military. I'm very surprised to see their attitude. And I don't know what the government has to hide, but I think that we really should do an in-depth study. And I think that the witnesses that we are people we should be hearing. And it's important to really look at this cultural problem when we look at sexual assault within the Canadian Armed Forces. This is a subject which is very important. And what I've noted, I think that my colleagues, my Liberal colleagues, are trying to really contradict all of this. And I think that if you look at go talk to any victim of sexual assault in the army, they want to know what happened with the CDS, and they'll say keep the investigation open, because the reality is that they're the bosses, and they want to be able to trust what's happening within the institution. So they also want to have a clear idea of what happens to the bosses. So why should it be hidden what's happening at the highest level of power within the Canadian Army? I think this is of great concern. I think it's necessary that we take a look at this culture in armed forces. So with respect to that, I'd like to ask the Liberal colleagues why they don't want to consider this motion, and also why we wouldn't vote right now, because I think everybody has a chance to express themselves. So I think that we could move ahead with a vote.
All right. Thank you. I have Mr. Spengeman and then Madame Vanderbilt.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. And I just wanted to follow up on the previous comment and echo colleagues who have said that rather than anybody wanting to shut down the study, the idea is to focus our energies on those issues that matter most, and those issues that have been longstanding, and those issues that are echoed by witnesses, and most importantly, female victims and their families and men who are allies on the issue of gender equality. And Madam Chair, just to refer you back briefly to a report that this very committee did in the last Parliament of June 2019, entitled "Improving Diversity and Inclusion in the Canadian Armed Forces." It's a broader issue than the issues of sexual harassment and misconduct. But Mr. Bazan, Mr. Garrison, Ms. Gallant, Mr. Robillard, myself, we were part of that committee, and there were some great recommendations put forward with respect to leadership within the Canadian Forces on the issue of gender equality. We should stay in that track and focus more specifically now on the issue of sexual misconduct and harassment and the systemic nature of it. It's not a question of shutting down the study, it's a question of directing it to what matters most. And my intervention, Madam Chair, really is aimed at supporting the comments of my colleague Ms. Vandenbelt to strategically use the subcommittee to identify those witnesses that will put us onto that track and take us forward.
Madame Vanderbilt.
Yes, no, thank you very much, Madam Chair. And, just on what was said by my colleague opposite, we know how important this study is. We know that the study that's starting in status of women is vitally important. We already have witnesses that we proposed many weeks ago, like the current Canadian Armed Forces Champion for Women and others that have tremendous recommendations to bring, which I'm sad to say were rejected by all the opposition parties at the Status of Women Committee when I brought them forward last week. We have those names already. We have a number of witnesses that have already been proposed that the chair has invited. I think that it is very reasonable that we would continue this study and make sure that we come up with the right recommendations for the minister, who has said very clearly that all options are on the table. He wants to hear from parliamentary committees on this. Having said that, I really don't think we want to be here all day. I have said before, and I will continue to say, that the practice of surprising people with a name one by one and voting one person at a time at meetings is not the best procedure in this committee. Having said that, I think we're probably prepared to vote on this one right away, because I note that it is 1 o'clock and members, this committee meeting was supposed to end at 1. I know there was a notice of motion. If we want to vote on that quickly, I just have one small note, which is that in those motions, and if Mr. Bazan could clarify the timeline in the current one, because given that we have 2 constituency weeks coming, if you say 14 days, it requires a meeting during that constituency break time. So if we could just make sure that both of those motions say 21 days instead of 14 days, so that it can be at the next meeting of the committee that's currently scheduled, then I think we're prepared to vote on both of those right away. But just please, as a practice, I had names that came out of today that I would love to put forward as well. But, I think that we need to give each other the courtesy of having time to consult one another and talk to each other about names and which ones are priorities and how long we want to continue the study. I think these are all legitimate questions. But, Madam Chair, if there's nobody else on the speaking list, I think we could proceed to a vote on this motion, presuming that it didn't have a timeline of 14 days. I just want to clarify.
Just for clarification, Madam Chair, there is no timeline
Okay.
at all, because I left that up to the discretion of the chair and the steering committee.
Okay.
So on neither of those motions, there's a time limit.
On the one that we're voting on, there's no timeline. The notice of motion that we brought forward, there is, and we can deal with that when that's on the floor. Let's not cross our wires yet.
Okay, so this is the motion that was just brought forward from Mr. Bazan to call Monsieur Daniel Jean. Is that correct? Anyone voting against that motion?
Chair, I had my hand up.
Oh, go ahead, Mr. Baker.
Chair, I would like to propose that to Mr. Bazan's motion that we, a sub-amendment, that we limit the meeting with this witness to 1 hour.
Would anybody like to weigh in on that?
I think it's the important role that the National Security Advisor plays, based upon the testimony that we heard today, on carrying out and heading up both the vetting process and the investigations within PCO. I think that there's a lot of questions to be asked, and it's only fair to all committee members if we hear from Danielle Jean for a full 2 hours.
Madam Chair, I know that one by one having witnesses just for 2 hours. I know that traditionally we have had panels, and I note that the chair, you've been very good about making sure that panels are of like mind, so that we can ask similar questions. But I don't think the motion said that we would have this single witness for 2 hours, because I think that if we do that with every witness, we're going to be on this study for months. But if that wasn't in the motion, then I think we can leave it to the discretion of the chair.
And just for clarification, I didn't ask for him to appear individually.
Okay,
I just asked for 2 hours.
Then we're good.
Actually, ideally, I'd like to see him appear alongside Mr. Warnick.
Okay, well, then we're good. Yeah.
Okay, so just need to clarify with clerk.
Madam Chair.
Go ahead.
It is not customary to have panels. It is. It has become an abnormal series of meetings to have panels, but we find that if we have more than one person on a panel at a time, that we do not have adequate time to ask the questions of the individuals on that panel. So please don't build up the panels to the point where we don't have an opportunity to ask the necessary questions.
It's been my experience that panels are more the norm than not, but I understand what you're asking for, and we'll take that into account. All right, then. So we have a final. Can you have Mr. Bazan's motion, this one? Can I read it?
Point of order, Chair.
Okay.
Madam Chair, I just wanted to, I think I moved an amendment to Mr. Bazan's motion, and I just wanted to make sure that we had an opportunity to vote on that.
Okay, so I guess we have to deal with the amendment first, reducing from 2 hours to 1 hour. Is there anyone who is contrary against that amendment?
Chair,
Yes.
Chair, if I may, I apologize. I'd like to seek unanimous consent to withdraw that.
Oh, okay. Anyone to deny unanimous consent? No? All right. Okay. So the amendment's been withdrawn. It's to the main motion to invite. And I would appreciate at least having something on paper. It really makes it a lot easier for me to keep it straight.
Madam Chair, we'll get that into you. But that was one that we did just based upon what we heard. It's a table drop, and I moved it verbally, kind of based it off the structure of previous motions, but I'll read it one more time, just so everybody is clear on it.
Okay.
That the Standing Committee on National Defence concerning its study on addressing sexual misconduct issues in the Canadian Armed Forces, including the allegations against former Chief of Defence Staff Jonathan Vance and Admiral Art MacDonald, summon Daniel Jean to appear for no less than 2 hours, that these meetings be held in public and be televised.
Okay, go ahead, Madame Vanderbilt.
Yeah, I understood the first time that the member said it. He asked to invite Daniel.
Yeah, invite,
Jean?
not summon. It's
okay,
invite,
thank
invite.
you. Okay.
Yeah, it's invite Daniel Jean.
Okay, the clerk is asking that you repeat it once again. So this is why if we could have a quick written copy, that'd be good. Go ahead, Mr.
I've
Bazan.
asked my office to send it in, but I'll do it one more time. That the Standing Committee on National Defence concerning the study on addressing sexual misconduct issues in the Canadian Armed Forces, including the allegations against former Chief of Defence Staff Jonathan Vance and Admiral Art MacDonald, invite Daniel Jean, former National Security Advisor, that he appear for no less than 2 hours, and that these meetings be held in public and be televised.
Okay, now are we ready to vote on that motion? Anyone who is against that motion? I see no hands up, so the motion carries.
Madam Chair, I'd like to just move the motion that I gave notice on, that the Standing Committee on National Defence concerning that study of addressing sexual misconduct issues in the Canadian Armed Forces, including the allegations against former Chief of Defence Staff Jonathan Vance and Admiral Art MacDonald, invite Gregory Lick, Ombudsman for National Defence and the Canadian Armed Forces, to testify for the committee, that the witness appear for no less than 2 hours, that the meeting be held in public and be televised, and that the witnesses be called to testify within 15 days of this motion passing. So, Madam Chair, we have seen that Ombudsman Lick has been in the news recently, talking about the role that Gary Walbourne has played in the past, that he was treated unfairly, and as well talking about that the Ombudsman's office should be made independent. So, Madam Chair, I think that it is only responsible on our part to hear from the current ombudsman about the role of the ombudsman's office, as well as the treatment of Gary Walbourne.
All right, thank you, Madame Vanderbilt.
Madam Chair, I think that that's a very reasonable person to call before the committee. Having said that, we, of course, don't have meetings. We have Friday's meeting already booked and then no meetings for 14 days. So if I would like to propose an amendment to say within 21 days, not within 14 days.
Okay, we have an amendment on the floor to the main motion, which amends the timeline for the invitation from 14 days to 21 days. Anyone against that motion, that amendment?
I'd just like to speak to it briefly.
Okay, go ahead, Mr. Bazan.
You know, Madam Chair, you know, we are dealing with a large issue here that is really demoralized Canadian Armed Forces, and they need to know what role different individuals and officers play within the Department of National Defense. And it is inherent upon us to talk to all those officials. And even though Parliament may not be sitting for 2 weeks, I think it's important that we take that one meeting at least during the break for us to continue to work on this study. I think it's just too important. I don't believe anybody is going to be running off to spring break and partying on the beaches in Florida. So I think it's more important that we do this work and get down to answers. I know how important it is to be in our constituencies, but you know, most of us are working from home these days anyway, and are able to deal with the our constituency issues then. So I believe that this would be at least one meeting during that 2-week off from Parliament sitting would be in order, and I'd request that committee support that.
Go ahead, Madam Vanderbilt.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think it is very much not appropriate to assume that we would be using those 2 weeks to go on beach vacations. Frankly, I know that MPs work incredibly hard during constituency weeks to be able to touch base with the very people whose views we're here to try to represent. And I would note, Madam Chair, just for the record, that in every single constituency week for the last several months, either this committee or now the Status of Women Committee has held meetings during the constituency weeks on this topic. And I do believe that it is very important to be debating this topic. I also think, however, that we've now got a lot of witnesses that we're calling on this topic, but I think it is very important that we spend time with our constituents as well. So I would just like to go to a vote on the amendment to the 21 days. Thank you.
And just as a point of order, I wasn't accusing anyone that we'd be going on holidays. I just was saying that all of us are stuck at home. So,
all right, go ahead, Mr. Baker.
Thanks, Chair. I really wanted to speak to this. I think what's important for me anyway, in my riding in Etobicoke Centre is that if I'm going to do my job effectively as an MP, I need to also be able to spend that time with my constituents. That doesn't mean it's face-to-face. There's face-to-face over the phone is really secondary, but right now the constituency work in my office, and I realize that the pandemic's hit different parts of the country differently, and I respect that. But certainly in my community, a lot of folks are struggling and are reaching out to me for help or for guidance or for discussion about government policy, et cetera. And so, and I'm sure all the members on this committee are receiving a significant amount of those types of that type of outreach from their constituents. And I think so. Whether I'm physically present when it's an Ottawa week, so-called Ottawa week, right now during the pandemic, as I'm sure is the case for most of my colleagues here, our obligations as legislators occupy almost all of my time between committees and preparation for these discussions in committees and the caucus meetings that allow us to advocate for whatever issues we believe are important for our constituents. So those constituency weeks are really important blocks of time that are set aside for us to be able to serve our constituents. Of course, outside of pandemic time, that means that we're physically in our ridings. It would make it impossible in those circumstances for the committee to meet unless under very unusual circumstances.
All right, thank you very much. I appreciate that. We have an amendment on the floor. So, and that amendment on the floor, we want to bring it to a vote. So
I raise my hand.
Okay. All right. Okay. Go ahead. Oh, there's Mr. Robillard. Okay. Thank you very much. Go ahead, Mr. Robillard.
I don't want to take too much of our time, but I only want to tell everybody I'm a very understanding person, and I agree with what Mr. Baker said, but I don't like to have other members of the committee judging me. Please, I'm respectful to you. Please be respectful to everybody.
Right. Merci beaucoup, Mr. Robillard. All right.
Thank you very much, Mr. Robillard.
We need a vote on the amendment. All those opposed to the amendment from 14 days to 21 days in order to call the witness. Anyone who is that correct? Do I have a correct understanding? Anyone who is opposed to the Mr. Bazin? Okay, here we go. Okay, so we'll need to take a vote, so the clerk will get that set up and we'll take a recorded division.
Question is on the amendment of moved by Ms. Vandenbeld. Mr. Bagnall. He said in favor. Mr. Bagnall, could you please repeat?
In favor.
In favor.
In favor.
Thank you. Mr. Baker.
In favor.
Monsieur Robillard.
In favor.
Mr. Spangeman.
In favor.
Ms. Vandenbeld.
In favor.
Mr. Benson.
Against.
Mr. Bizan.
Opposed.
Mr. Dowdell.
Opposed.
Scalan.
Opposed.
Monsieur Barsalou Duval.
Contre.
Against.
Mr. Garrison.
Opposed.
All right, so the amendment is defeated. On to the main motion. Is anyone who wants to vote against the main motion? Yep. Looks like we have unanimous consent then on the main motion. Go ahead, Madame Vanderbilt.
No, after.
Okay, so we have unanimous consent on the main motion. Motion carries.
Madam
Go ahead,
Chair.
Madame
Madam Chair,
Vanderbilt.
motion to adjourn?
No.
Dan had his hand up before she said that.
Fine.
Go ahead, Mr. Bazan.
Madam Chair, just at the beginning of the meeting, I asked a question about whether or not all witnesses had accepted our invitation to attend. In particular, I'm interested in whether Ms. Zita Estradas and Elder Marquillas had accepted our invitation. Could you give us an update?
All right, so we have heard from Mr. Marquez, and it looks he's in negotiations with the clerk at this present time, has indicated that there is an openness to the idea. We have not heard back from Madame Estradas.
On that, then, Madam Chair, I move the following, that the Standing Committee on National Defense concerning the study on addressing sexual misconduct issues in the Canadian Armed Forces, including the allegations against former Chief of Defence Staff Jonathan Vance and Admiral Art MacDonald, summon Zita Estravis, and that she appear individually for no less than 2 hours, that this meeting be held in public and be televised, and that the witness be called to testify within 10 days of this motion passing.
Okay, open to debate. Madame Vandenbelt and then Mr. Baker.
Madam Chair, first of all, we know that we've issued these invitations, and we are, I think, at a point where, you know, as I'd mentioned last time, in this entire history of this Defense Committee, Mr. Walburn was the first person we summoned. Mr. Trotter was the second person we summoned in the history of this committee. And I think this is something that, you know, we really need to take very seriously. When you have invitations that have gone out and you've got the clerk reaching out to people and you know, as I've said before, you know, we have to be very careful using the power that this committee has to summon people. Having said that, I was very much trying, you know that I've said many times that this, you know, one motion after another, one by one, voting on people, this is not the best way to conduct business in this committee. We have a steering committee. We have the ability to sit down together as members, prioritize who we want to invite, prioritize the amount of time we want to spend on each study, plan out our studies. That's very traditionally, and that's the way that things have been done on this committee. Being sort of, you know, having a name thrown out and having to quickly consult our colleagues and come to a consensus in the middle of a committee meeting isn't the best way to conduct business. I do appreciate the member, Mr. Bazan, for giving notice about the motion on Mr. Lick. I think that's a good practice in this committee, and I was okay with, you know, debating and voting on that because we had a bit of notice on that. But this idea, you know, one of the reasons that I felt that we could go to a vote originally on the two that you brought up was because I thought, okay, at that point, we can adjourn. There's already been an agreement to have a steering committee meeting during the break. And at that point, we can sit down and discuss as a committee. But there's a certain point where I think that this kind of just, you know, throwing things out like this and asking for a vote and asking for summons. And, you know, we have responsibilities here as a parliamentary committee to use our power in a responsible way. We have responsibilities to our colleagues, to each other, to make sure that we are giving each other advance notice of things that we want to debate in this committee. And this kind of just let's keep on going one by one, throwing names out the way that we have. And, you know, I don't know how many other names that the member opposite might want to do. We know that this meeting was supposed to end at 1:00, but you know, we could do the same. We could have a list of names of people that we submitted quite some time ago. I would say that some of the names, Madam Chair, that we submitted when this study first started was about 6 weeks ago, and they haven't been called yet. They haven't been brought to this committee. I know that the chair was giving priority to some of the names coming from the opposition, but I'd love to hear from somebody like Rear Admiral Rebecca Patterson. I would love to hear from some of the other names that we put in of people who really have lived this, who understand the issue, who want to talk about how we make it better. And I know that, you know, trying to find out who knew what when and pointing fingers back and forth, I know that that's something that, you know, it is a legitimate thing. But when I talk to the women, when I talk to survivors, the message I'm getting from them is we have finally a parliamentary committee looking at this issue, studying this issue at a time when women with great courage are stepping up, are stepping forward, believing that we as leaders are listening to them and genuinely want to make this better. And I want to hear from them. I think the Status of Women Committee has a tremendous opportunity. And I put forward a list of names that includes Dr. Preston, who we heard from. It includes Professor Eichler, Maya Eichler, who, by the way, when she came to this committee, she gave her opening statement and had no time for questions because it was motions and points of order and the same sort of thing that we're seeing today, where it's just trying to put a name forward and have a vote, and should we summon, and should we, and frankly, she never got a chance to answer any questions. She has spent her career as an academic, as an expert on sexual misconduct in the military, and she never got a chance to answer questions. I brought her name to come to the Status of Women Committee, and all the opposition parties combined voted against her. I brought a name like Julie Lalonde, who is an expert on culture change within institutions. She is a feminist who has even been consulted by the military at the Royal Military College, and she has a lot to say on this. And her name was rejected by the opposition in the Status of Women Committee. Many of these names are on the list that we've provided to the chair. I'm not going to go through one by one and name individual private citizens and put them on the spot, so they would then have to turn around and explain publicly why they did or did not accept an invitation to this committee. But I have to say that in terms of collegiality and process, in terms of parliamentary courtesy, this idea that all we're doing here is throwing another name of somebody to see if we can maybe try to get more, to try to score points. Frankly, I think we need to stop. I think we need to hear from the women. I think we need to hear from the veterans, from the serving women in the Canadian Armed Forces whose roles and responsibility is to do exactly this. We have a minister who came to this committee and said, every option is on the table. He wants to change things. He wants to make a difference, and he wants this committee to come up with recommendations. I'm going to just ask one more time of all members of this committee to step back from this kind of let's summon and let's step back from that. We have a meeting on Friday. We've agreed to a steering committee meeting over the 2 constituency weeks. We've also agreed to a meeting over the constituency weeks now with Mr. Lick and possibly some of the others that we've asked for. And I think that if we could perhaps agree to just adjourn the debate right now and wait until we have that steering committee meeting and discuss how we want to proceed with this study. And frankly, let's listen to what the women are saying, and men, but what survivors and those impacted are saying. They are saying all of this pointing fingers between one party and another party is not helping them. It is demotivating them. What they want to see is that this committee come up with recommendations, that we hear from the people who understand. The answers are out there. People understand what is needed. Everybody knows what needs to be done. And we need to be listening, and we need to be hearing from those people. And I would love to sit down and have a steering committee meeting and put together a list of people who can give us the excellent recommendations about what we're going to do to fix this problem, because it can't continue. You heard the minister say the time for patience is over. But I think that just in terms of the way in which this committee functions, we really need to go back to the courtesy where we work together, where we sit down and look at names, and we don't start using this power to summons in a way that has historically never been done in this House of Commons. If you look at the standing orders, at the bottom of the standing orders is a footnote, the annotated standing orders, with a handful of names over the history of the Parliament of Canada, of people who've actually been summoned to come here. We summoned Gary Walburn. I don't think we needed to. I think he would have come. I think if the clerk is currently in discussion with one of those witnesses who has said that, yes, he's willing to come. I would like to give the clerk a little bit more time to go back and forth with some of these people and to give them one more, give them a chance to come of their own volition. But honestly, Madam Chair, I'll hear from colleagues on this, but I think that sitting here all day today and debating something like this after the time of this committee is already formally supposed to have ended, I don't think that that helps the women. I don't think that helps the women of the Canadian Armed Forces. I don't think that helps the men and women who are victims. I don't think that that helps change the culture. I think all it does is it tells them, the people who are watching, that we're just playing politics. And frankly, that is not what I came here as a member of parliament to do. I'm here because I want to make sure that we do right by the people who serve our country. And I would very much encourage our colleagues to adjourn today and to come back next week in a steering committee meeting and really put forward names of people who are going to be able to move this file forward. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, go ahead, Mr. Baker.
Thanks, Chair. Given that we are well over our planned schedule, I move that the committee do now adjourn.
I believe that's out of order.
I think he meant the debate and do now adjourn on this.
All right.
Point of order, Chair.
Go ahead, Mr. Baker.
My understanding is that that's a dilatory motion and therefore it's in order.
Okay, Mr. Baker, can you go ahead and repeat what you brought to the floor earlier?
Yep. So given that we are well over our planned schedule, I move that the committee do now adjourn.
Recorded vote, please.
Stand by. We can do it. Stand by. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Bazan.
Just a question on a point of order, whether or not adjourning a committee meeting in the middle of a debate is in order, or should the motion be motion to adjourn debate?
According to the clerk, it is in order.
Okay.
We will take a recorded division.
In favor?
Mr. Baker,
In favor.
Monsieur Robillard,
In favor.
Mr. Spangerman, Mr. Spangerman,
I believe I'm replacing Mr. Spengleman.
Mr. McDonald,
In favor?
Ms. Vandenbell,
In favor.
Mr. Benson,
Oppose?
Mr. Bazan,
Opposed.
Mr. Dowdall,
Oppose.
Ms. Gallant,
Opposed.
Monsieur Barcelou Duval,
Contre.
Mr. Garrison.
Opposed?
Okay, motion is defeated. Go ahead, Madame Gallant.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So we just heard from the Chief of Staff for the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister, for 2 hours. We had fulsome questioning the entire 2 hours. There were no politics being played. The opposition is not simply throwing out names or playing politics. I thought we all committed to getting to the bottom of this very serious issue. Just throwing it off to another committee that is not that for which the Defense Committee is intended, and to follow through on our previous studies is just a distraction. We owe it to the women, as we've talked about before, as well as men, to get to the bottom of this. And by just passing it off to another committee that has a different take on things and not necessarily going down the military avenue. Madame Deschamps did her best and made the recommendations. They were not implemented. As we heard today, the National Investigative Service did not for whatever reason, do its part, whether they had nothing to go on or whether or not there was evidence that was put out of access to them. It is not known. We have a number of avenues we still have yet to investigate, and it is not to play politics. It's to set right once and for all what is terribly wrong and missing in this military. And if we ever hope to get to your Prime Minister's 25% of women in the military, we have to address this very serious problem now.
Go ahead, Mr. Baker.
Thanks, Chair. I want to just pick up on where Madame Gallant left off, and I think that's the crux of this, right? Is Madame Gallant spoke about the needs to address this problem now, and I think the debate we're having here really centers around what is the problem that we're trying to solve, and I think the problem that's impeding increasing numbers of women, minorities, other equity-seeking groups in the armed forces is the issue of, there's the issue of culture that we've heard about, of sexual harassment, of assault, and those issues are not the ones that we're tackling with this type of motion. This motion doesn't help us address those. This motion is not designed to address those. This motion is designed to further study what happened when, I won't even put words in Mr. Bazan's mouth, but it's meant to study things that won't help us address that underlying problem that is preventing us from attracting the best and brightest of all backgrounds to the Canadian Armed Forces and retaining the best and brightest of all backgrounds. And we've recently seen someone who, a very high profile person, leave the armed forces, a woman leave the armed forces, citing some of these very things. And we're not, as a committee, we're the Defense Committee, we talk about how big a problem it is, and then we're not passing motions that would allow us to actually address those problems. And so that's the underlying concern I have around the direction. The types of witnesses we're calling aren't helping us to solve the problem that the survivors, that minorities, that women have asked us to solve. And I've heard from people who are women who are survivors, and they're begging us to tackle this issue of the culture of toxic masculinity. They're asking us to address sexual assault and sexual violence in the armed forces and much more. And by continuing to pursue motions like this, we're not doing that. So that's just the underlying reality. Now, as far as the motion, the change, if you will, to the motion that Mr. Bazan has proposed to summon versus to invite, I mean, I have concerns with that. I think, this committees in the House of Commons operate on the basis of invite, and I don't think that that's necessary. I think we invite people to come. We make sure that we follow up with them. It takes time. I don't know, the background on the communication. I really don't. But I think, generally speaking, I'm speaking in general terms. Sometimes we're responded to as a committee quickly. Sometimes we're not responded to quickly. Just because we don't get a response quickly, we don't go out there and summon every time. That's not the way committees work. They haven't worked this way in the past. And I think this is an unprecedented step that sets, I think, dangerous and unhelpful precedents for future studies, including this one. So on the substance of the adding the word summons or altering the motion to the word summons, I have a concern about that. I also, maybe, I wanted to speak to something that Ms. Vandenbeld spoke to earlier, which is the way in which we work together. I think about how maybe I come from, my background prior to this was as a member of provincial parliament in Ontario, and perhaps the culture there is different. I don't know, but it is not. I'm not accustomed at that level or at the federal level until very recently in this committee that we're just springing motions on each other left and right. I think if we want to make thoughtful decisions about how we vote, we need time to consider what's being proposed and the implications of what's being proposed, to discuss it with each other, to hear each other out, and do that in a thoughtful way. And that the approach to sort of surprising folks with motions after motion after motion, I think is not helpful to us coming to the best list of witnesses to study what we want to study. I know we're disagreeing on what we should study. I know some of us are saying, let's focus on addressing the underlying problems. Let's focus on understanding what's causing this culture of toxic masculinity. Let's figure out how to solve it. Some of us are arguing, no, let's talk about other things. So that's a separate issue. And I urge us to focus on the victims and their needs and how we solve the underlying problems that has made them victims. But that said, I also think that, like, in working together, I think we springing motions on each other is not helpful. And I think the summons is unnecessary. I see no evidence to believe that it is necessary. What I would suggest is that we have a series of scheduled meetings already. We have a series of witnesses coming. We've agreed to that. Let's move forward with that. I think that should be our immediate next step. Thanks.
All right, go ahead, Mr. Bagnall.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I just wanted to reiterate what I said before. I think somehow we have to, instead of just dealing with a few people, we have to deal with the over 1,000 of people that have been involved through the surveys that have been done in this terrible situation. And so I'm not sure how we get on track to that. Maybe we need to, Ms. Vandenbeld needs to add witnesses, or people on the committee that need to add witnesses related to improving the system, related to changing the culture that the experts have said is the major part of the problem. But as Mr. Baker said, I think the people watching want us to get on with dealing with the structural changes, the procedural changes, the culture changes, so that for both men and women, the culture of the masculinity, it doesn't prevail to the extent that people are uncomfortable serving there, uncomfortable in reporting, and that action will be taken on their reports. Thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Ruff.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd just like to bring up, and as somebody that obviously I think most of the committee's aware has served 25 years and likely is one of the more recent members of Parliament to have served, and know a number of the players, including Lieutenant Colonel Taylor personally, who has obviously resigned from the military in disgust and disappointment. But I do speak with a level of confidence that the rank and file do want to understand how a situation occurred that allowed the Chief of Defense Staff to have allegations brought forward and not to have those allegations properly investigated. And this is something the minister in committee on the 12th of November, 12th of March, the last time I participated in it, admitted he was responsible for the failure of those allegations to come forward. So I think it's completely appropriate to get these witnesses here as soon as possible in order to testify, because we need to get to the root of what allowed this situation to occur. And then we can tackle very appropriately the structural changes that are required in the Canadian Armed Forces. Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you. It was brought up by the clerk that Ms. Astravaz has not denied the invitation. And normally we summons when people refuse to appear. So as far as I know, it's not been a refusal. And I think it's also, it's summoning someone, I think sets a very high precedent, really. And I'm not sure, is this something we can talk about in the steering committee meeting? Like we can decide, are there certain criteria by which, I don't know, people decide to make it a summons instead of an invitation? But just the clerk wanted to make sure. He's still, as I said, in conversation with somebody else. It sometimes takes a little longer than people would like to admit. But if there has not been a refusal, do we actually want to go ahead and do a summons? It's something that we can definitely talk about. I think it would be totally appropriate to discuss this matter in the steering committee and actually come up with a consolidated way forward. How are we actually going to deal with issues of this nature and the issue of things like summonses? So I would like to have a steering committee very much in the near future. And this is also one of those things that we could discuss at that time. Plus, as well, what the ongoing scope and focus of this study will be. So just we'll go to, just for a couple of points for your consideration, we'll go to Mr. Baker and then we'll go to Madame Gallant.
Chair, thank you. I was going to speak to that very issue and ask you whether Ms. Estravis had declined or not. I think that, like, to me, it's at that point that committees decide whether or not they want to summon or not. Not when we have a delay in a response for whatever reason. I don't know. I think that's just a dangerous precedent to set. I think we need to give the time for those, for whatever the outreach is, the scheduling. We don't know what's happening, what Mrs. Estravis is dealing with. We don't know what the communication issue, why she hasn't responded. We don't know, and so I think a summons is a very, very harsh tool, and it's not justified when someone hasn't refused to testify. They just haven't responded. So I think that's the precedent that's been set. It's the precedent that's been set by MPs of all parties for going back decades. And so I just think we should realize that precedent was set, that MPs of all parties, whether it's majority governments, minority governments, have operated that way for a reason, right? And I think we get one of the reasons I think that is because for the most part, not always perhaps, but for the most part, we get the best content and insight from our witnesses when we invite them, rather than when we summon them. And I think that's one of the reasons I just, the other reason is that because I don't think it's necessary, and I think it's not required in this case. And I think it's not necessary to ask Mrs. Estravis to, it's normal, it's understandable that we want to invite her. I think we've extended the invitation. I think we should give a reasonable period of time for that invitation to be heard and responded to. We don't know what's causing that delay in response. There's a lot going on right now, including a pandemic. And I'd ask us to just respect that and not set a new precedent that we will regret.
All right, Madame Gallant.
The government members seem to be doing everything they can to delay, deflect, stop Mrs. Stratus from appearing before the committee. We may be in the last weeks of this parliament, which would mean it could be another 9 months to a year before we get back on track with following through with this investigation and getting results for the women in the armed forces. I'm wondering if the clerk would be able to share with us the outline of the number of times that he has tried or heard back from? Has there been a going back and forth with the ZTA, or have you just sent it out and not heard back, the invitation? Could you detail that for the committee, please?
Madam Chair, I attempted on a few occasions to speak on the phone with Ms. Astrovas. I was not able to I was not able to connect directly to her, so I left a voicemail, or I left a message, and I also sent one email and one reminder.
You attempted to contact her?
Three times.
And over a span of time, or one right after the other in the same day? No official letter has gone out, or any invitation by mail, or
an invitation by email, and a reminder over I don't have the exact timeline, but over 10 days.
Right, and given that we have the Parliamentary Secretary for Defence in this meeting, one would think that the message could be communicated to her somehow. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Bagnall, please.
Yeah, I was going to say that that we have significant time to try and get a response. There's the rest of this week. There's already a meeting proposed for the end of this week, and then the weekend. So we have some time to hear a response, and then we could proceed if we don't get any response.
Go ahead, Mr. Ruff.
Yes, thanks, Madam Chair. I'll just go back to the clerk's response because it wasn't clear, at least I didn't pick up on it maybe with the audio, is can he please confirm the exact number of times he emailed and phoned and the dates and times that he did that, so that it's clear for us how spread out this attempts to contact and who he called in trying to get a hold of it. Is there a personal listed number in the government directory? Was it through the office staff, etc.? We want to know who and how, please. Thanks.
Well, we asked, just so you know, we did ask for people with knowledge. If you know how to get a hold of this person, we asked that information be provided to the clerk. And the clerk used whatever information that was provided to try and reach out. Now, if the information that the opposition provided was not accurate, and then maybe we have not found the correct avenue moving forward. So we did ask everyone to, submit information to the clerk, and that he would go ahead and look into whatever was provided. So, but there's no guarantee that what was provided was correct. So,
Madam Chair, I'm not asking whether or not it was correct or not. I'm asking for confirmation of what numbers, when, how many times, at what date. Obviously, the staffer we're trying to get a hold of is a chief of staff to a minister in the government. This is not somebody that's hidden away, that's retired, that's gone somewhere across country that we can't track down. I mean, I'm sure I'm more than capable of walking over to this person's office and passing this information on personally if we can't get a hold of them. So I mean, I'm more than willing to volunteer to do that if the House of Commons staff needs assistance. Thanks.
I just want to say that it's a significant step forward when it's to, and I would like to get information from the law clerk, actually about what the precedent is, and is there a precedent? Is there a set of criteria that we use to determine what the seriousness is that would necessitate a summons? Like, it's not something that I'm all that knowledgeable about, And I would like to learn a little bit more. I think it's a very serious
Madam Chair,
process that's available to us. And I would like to have the opportunity to meet in the steering committee. And if the steering committee just decides that this is the right way forward, well, then fine. But I would like to have the opportunity to talk about this in the steering committee so that we are all aware of the seriousness of issuing a summons. And then if we get that briefing and we still decide we still want to do it, fine, then we do it. But before we take a really significant step forward,
Madam Chair,
then I think that it's important that we discuss this and we have all of the information we need in order to make that decision instead of something that's coming in at the last moment that had not been sent to the committee in advance, that we have the time we need to actually consider this very serious motion. But that's my 2 cents. Go ahead, Madame Gallant.
Yeah, with all due respect, Madam Chair, it's not your role to decide whether or not we have to defer to the law clerk, whether or not a motion is in order or not. We should be focused on the matter at hand. We know that the witness we're asking for is in the office of the Minister of Public Safety. Perhaps we should have the RCMP see if they can find her. But this is more subterfuge, it would appear, and delays for whatever reason. The government members do not want to have her before this committee. We feel she can be helpful in explaining to us exactly what happened and how the process occurred so that we can correct it for the future.
All right.
Madam Chair, point of order.
Go ahead, Mr. Ruff.
I didn't realize I'd ceded the floor. Again, to go back to my original question, it was addressed to the clerk just to ask him to provide the date, times, and the phone numbers that he contacted or tried to invite the witness. And if I could just have that, if he doesn't have that information available immediately, if he could ensure that gets passed to the committee and put on the record, please. I will now turn over the floor, but I'd like a response from the clerk, please.
We will discuss with the clerk afterwards. All right. Go ahead, Mr. Baker.
Thanks, Chair. I wanted to follow up on a couple of things that Madame Gallant said. One was she was alluding to Ms. Glenn made mention that it's not the chair's role to decide anything. For the record, I don't think that the chair was trying to decide anything. I think the chair is trying to contribute to a constructive solution to the questions that are being raised. And I think that that's completely within the chair's role to do so. As far as the other point that Madame Gallant made that I have concerns about is that she said that the government members don't want Ms. Estrabas to appear, and that's not at all true. It's very clear that we've voted already on a motion to invite Ms. Estrabas to appear, and so it's the will of the committee that she appear. That includes the members, the Liberal members, the members of the Liberal caucus who are on this committee, and so that's not what's up for debate here at all. What's up for debate here is whether a summons is required, and I think that the summons is unnecessary because it's not because for a few reasons. One is this study, as we've just voted on and agreed on, has time left in it. We still have time to discuss what we need to do as a committee to make sure that we hear from all the people we want to hear from. And so we're looking at least another 2 weeks, if I'm not mistaken, and I could be corrected. It could be longer, but it's at least 2 weeks for this study. And so if that's the case, then we have we have further meetings where this particular issue can be debated and discussed. But I think we should exhaust the option of inviting Ms. Estrabas before we summon her. And I think there's a lot of good reasons for that. There's the precedents that we've talked about. There's making sure that we get the best possible testimony and insight. And I think if there's a lot of reasons why someone may not have responded, it's not for us to speculate what that is, but I think it is for us to follow precedent, as the clerk has pointed out. Usually you don't summon someone unless they refuse to appear. And that's not the case in this case. And I just think we should give time for that, for us to hear back from Ms. Estravis for that reason.
All right, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Spengeman.
Madam Chair, thanks very much. I had to sub out for a bit. I'm just getting my bearings here in the discussion, but I think there's a couple of points that are important. I think the most important of which is, of course, the question before us, which is how do we change the culture in the Canadian Forces with respect to sexual harassment and sexual misconduct. Pretty much every witness that's been in front of us has said that, and members across party lines on the committee have echoed that. That's where the committee's energies should go. And with respect to witness selections, I think just about an hour ago, a very important point was made, was just that we have the mechanism of a subcommittee to talk about witnesses and to reach agreements, which would keep the committee's time focused on what matters most. With respect to the exercise of a summons, I understand that there's very strong precedent to not issue a summons if somebody has not specifically declined an invitation, as my colleague has just mentioned that Ms. Estravis is willing to come, has indicated a willingness. The committee has indicated a willingness to hear her. There has been no rejection from her part, and for that reason, I think that that channel needs to be open and worked through. And again, the committee's attention has been in the last few sessions in large part on the allegations against the former Chief of Defence Staff, the investigation. There's important questions that flow from that the committee has heard and needs to hear for accountability reasons. But the bigger question, it's no longer an elephant in the room. It's a very open question, certainly since the ERA in 2015, has been the culture in the Canadian Forces that is not only very disparately affecting women who are serving today, but equally discouraging women and men from considering the Canadian Forces as a career choice. And that really, I think, in the last Parliament and in this Parliament, has been the attention of the committee and needs to remain so. So let's use our strategic tools. Let's be thoughtful about this. Let's get the right people into the room. Let's move the yardsticks. And I think there's a lot of goodwill across party lines to do that. And the most recent witness that we had in front of us earlier today was also quite emphatic with respect to the structural and cultural changes that need to happen. And it was good to hear from a former Chief of Staff to a former Prime Minister words that really echo almost to the word the commitment of the current Minister of National Defence. So I'll put it back to you, Madam Chair, and I think we should move forward in an efficient, expeditious manner and solve the questions before us.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Spengeman. Mr. Bagnall, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And yeah, I just want to speak to the precedent too. Considering that we have time, it's not like we don't have time to hear back. You know, to make that draconian step that's very seldom used, but it's there if we need it. All the committees said that they want Ms. Estravis, and no one, and she hasn't said she wouldn't appear. And we're not even having a meeting till Friday, so there's lots of time to hear back from her and to people to get in touch with her to make sure she's got the appropriate message and can get back to the committee without having to, you know, maybe set a bad procedural precedent which may end up in being studied, and to change those powers if they're used frivolously before we even need them, by throwing it in the overtime of a meeting after the meetings, you know, time has expired. And back to the point I've made at all the meetings is we should really, the people that are watching in the military want to be safe and comfortable, that the system that's over 1,000 people have mentioned is a problem. I've had terrible situations. We need to deal with the processes, the culture, the ability for someone to report and feel comfortable. These are major structural issues, and we're really not focusing on those as much as we should, from my view. We could have this committee could really have a major effect on the military if we deal with the large problem at hand and come up with recommendations to deal with that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Bagnall. Mr. Baker, please.
Thanks very much, Chair. I want to pick up where Mr. Bagnall left off. I think he's right. We have a meeting Friday. We can discuss this at the Friday meeting or the meeting after that or the meeting after that. We have a number of meetings scheduled. So I think we have lots of time. This is not to make this, to consider this, but at this point, I think it's too early and it's unfair. And I think we should all sort of give pause and think about what precedent we're setting and what this does if we just start summoning when we don't hear from witnesses at committees. I think that's dangerous. I think it's dangerous to our work, to the partisanship on committees, to getting things done just in general. I think Mr. Ruff said something that I think is interesting. I mean, Mr. Ruff offered to, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he kind of offered to help the clerk to try to track down the person we're trying to reach out to, and I think that's kind of the spirit of what we should be focused on, in my view, which is, how do we reach Mrs. Stravis, make sure she's being contacted at the appropriate place, that there isn't something happening that's not causing her not to respond. I don't know, but I think approaching it that way is, I think, more constructive and useful. It just allows us to just make sure we exhaust the invitation option. We haven't exhausted that. Mrs. Stravis hasn't refused to appear. We don't know what's happening and why she hasn't responded. So I think we just need to give that the invitation time to play out. I think a summons is incredibly harsh and unnecessary under these circumstances. We being committees in this parliament, past parliaments, have not used the summons like this. We all know that, and I think it's unfair to the individual, and I think it's unfair to future committees who will then for which the precedent will have been set that if someone doesn't respond within a relatively brief period of time, then we start summoning people. I think that has incredibly damaging effects, reputational and otherwise, that are unnecessary. I think let's just take stock of the impact that's going to have if we keep doing this to people. If somebody refuses to come, it's fair game to have that discussion. But if someone hasn't refused to come, I don't think that's fair to the person. And I think there's still hope I'm sure there's hope still to reach Mrs. Stravis, and then Mr. Ruff proposed some solutions. I'm not sure if those are the right ones or not. I'm not going to pretend to know, but the point is, let's try to do what we can to reach her and hear back from her. That's the issue at play here. Nobody's said she shouldn't testify or doesn't want to, and the members of this committee, certainly on the government side, have been supportive of having her present and testify. So let's not go the route of the summons. I think that's extreme at this juncture and has damaging effects.
All right, thank you. Madame Gallant.
Yeah, so, Madam Chair, the clerk has tried to reach Ms. Estevez over the course of 6 weeks multiple times. No response whatsoever. We've asked for her. The committee is well versed, as given the other committees that have had to put forth summons. The public is now well versed in what is required in a summons. So I don't think we need to take up a meeting or any side time for a briefing from a clerk on the seriousness of a summons. And given all the interference that we've gotten from different members, it's pretty well time to call the question and on the motion that's before the floor and get a result on a vote. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's Mr. Spengeman, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And again, I apologize for having missed probably a 30-minute segment of the committee's discussion, for having to sub out. I think when I came back, there was just the tail end of an exchange involving my colleague, Mr. Ruff, and the clerk's desk. And I would like to echo my colleague, Mr. Baker. I think a summons has it's heavy-handed. It's the strongest tool at our disposal with respect to making somebody appear. It is also a signal in the exercise of it. The committee is signaling that it has a perception that there's an unwillingness on the part of that particular witness to appear, and that willingness so far has not been expressed yet. If anything, there's no evidence with respect to Ms. Astravas's unwillingness to appear. In the meantime, I think it's important that the committee continue to direct its energies in parallel to that effort of solving this question in a constructive way. And again, I don't believe the summons at this stage would be appropriate. I'd like to hear from the clerk on this in terms of past practice and history. But I think it is important that the committee keeps its eye and its mind tuned to the utility of other witnesses that could come in the interim, and continue to inform the committee on their views with respect to the question of culture, which in my mind, we've heard testimony on it, but I don't think we've got some sense yet of how to resolve this. Right? We really need some recommendations, some advice. The minister's indicated that he's open to all options. We need to hear what this committee in 2021 should recommend to the government of Canada with respect to changing the culture in the armed forces. There are negative elements to the culture that we've heard descriptions of. There are also positive elements with respect to the commitment to excellence, to service, to the obligation to look out for one's teammate, one's fellow serving member of the Canadian Forces. These discussions, to my mind, have not led to us having a level of detail or precision with the ability to make recommendations to government. And I think that's really, if we fail on that, even if we answer the procedural questions, like the kind that are in front of the committee now with respect to the misconduct allegations, if we fail on the big questions, I think we'll have done a disservice to Canadians and to serving members and their families. So I would urge the committee to continue to not drop the ball on these parallel discussions. And again, I would not be supportive. And Madam Chair, through you, maybe we can hear briefly from the clerk on past practice. But from what I've heard now, I'm not supportive of the exercise of a summons under these circumstances.
Okay, thank you. We can ask the law clerk to talk to us about the kind of normal criteria for a summons, the precedence of summons, how often they're used. I believe that they can provide us a briefing on those topics, and maybe that would not be a bad idea in these circumstances. So we have Mr. Baker, I think, and then Mr. Barcelou-Duval.
Thanks, Chair. I thought Mr. Bagnall had his hand up first, but I'm happy to go if he'll relinquish his speaking order. Yeah, I think I wanted to just to speak to Mr. Spengeman. Really, I think raised an important point, which is like helping us to understand what the implications are of a summons. He spoke to some of those implications. I think we can all understand, which is, and he did it very clearly. Mr. Spengeman did indicate that this is signaling publicly that we believe that the witness is unwilling to appear, and we have no evidence to support that belief. So to do that, I think would be damaging and unfair. And I just think, let's think longer term here beyond this particular committee, in this particular hearing, or even this particular study. We want from Ms. Travis. I think we've invited her. That signals we want to hear from her. But let's think longer term. If we begin summoning people left and right, what that's going to do. And I think that would be something I'd like. I agree with Mr. Spengeman. It'd be great to hear from the law clerk on that issue, so we fully understand what we're voting on here, because we're sort of we're on unprecedented territory. Just using a summons when we have no evidence to suggest that someone doesn't want to appear. So I just wanted to second that suggestion and urge just to really consider that before voting on this.
Thank you very much. Monsieur Barcelou-Duval, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Barcelou-Duval. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I've been listening to the debate carefully, and I've restrained myself from making any interventions to be able to get an idea of all of the ideas and to get a thorough understanding of the whole questions of summons and the procedure. I'm a little bit less familiar with that procedure. I don't have a huge amount of experience and time on the committee, but so I think it would be a good idea to get some information. But I have a little bit of difficulty understanding the logic and the arguments that you can't ask whether or not you can really actually force somebody to come before the committee. I'm surprised, because if you follow that logic, as long as somebody doesn't answer, well, we don't have any right to force them to come as a witness. So you just, if you don't want to witness, all you simply have to not to answer. So I think that this is a little bit difficult to follow this logic, and it's not as though Madame Astravas, it's not as though she's disappeared and that we're not able to find her. If that is the case, well, I think it's a problem because, as far as I know, she's still working for the government, and so if the government isn't able to find its people to be able to have them come witness, well, you really have to start asking some serious questions. So maybe if we do have an opportunity, I know that it's maybe not everybody who has had a chance to express themselves. Maybe we could finish with this round table and then go ahead with a vote. People have spoken several times. They have expressed their ideas, and so I don't think we need to repeat the same arguments. Thank you very much.
Please.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. And one of the very important points of discussion of this committee has been the question of accountability, and adjunct to that question, the idea of independence, investigative independence. And we've heard from witnesses of all stripes, including witnesses today. The witness today who testified that it's not appropriate for a minister or a political entity to be involved in driving or leading or be part of an investigation. And the witness that's under discussion now, potential witness, Ms. Astravas, would be part of that political apparatus. I think the committee, as far as I understand, has come to a landing on the question that with respect to accountability, investigative processes need to be independent. We've got some very clear testimony that was given earlier today in exchange with my colleague, Mr. Baker, that makes that point very precisely. So just to contextualize the interest on the part of members of the committee to hear from this particular witness, it would be in that question of accountability and political independence from an investigation. That is one aspect of the committee's work. It's an important aspect. It shouldn't be slighted, as colleagues have pointed out, but it forms part of a much bigger whole, and the bigger whole has been left unanswered largely, or almost in its entirety since 2015, even though initiatives have been undertaken. And we've got a minister at the moment who came to this committee twice with tremendous openness to look at all options. And the committee, I think, now has a mandate to find those options. Going forward, what do we need to do to break down the barriers, to restore confidence of women, men, and Canadians of non-binary gender identity and expression who are serving in the Canadian Forces today, and equally importantly, who seek to serve in the Canadian Forces tomorrow and in years to come. So when the Canadian public looks at this committee, I think it will have a high level of expectation of actually achieving a substantive outcome beyond quibbling over what witness should appear under what procedural tact. And again, my view is strongly that, and maybe there's even an opportunity, Madam Chair, through you to hear from our clerk. I don't know if it has to go through the law clerk, but maybe there is some experience that would be useful in terms of the frequency of summons being applied. In the last Parliament before this committee, and some of my colleagues today were members of that committee, I do not recall the committee exercising its power to summons. There may have been discussion on that exercise, but if there were, they would have been left at with the conclusion that this is really a last resort measure. And again, it has implications with respect to the perceptions it generates. If a unwillingness to appear on behalf of a witness who has important salient information to offer is the case, then it may be a tool that is applied, but as a last resort. Madam Chair, maybe through you again, the question is there any information, any helpful counsel from the clerk currently in the room today with respect to the exercise of summons and the discretionary powers and how they should be applied by the committee that we could gather? If not, you mentioned the law clerk, that's fine. I think that would be a more comprehensive and probably more legal briefing, but just in terms of precedents and use in the past across committees, it's my sense that this mechanism is used extremely rarely and may in many committees never have been used. Thanks, Madam Chair.
All right, thank you. The clerk says that the law clerk is the one who can best answer those kind of questions. So, but probably be worthwhile. So we have Mr. Baker and then Mr. Ruff, please.
Thanks very much, Chair. Je voulais répondre un peu à ce que.
I wanted to respond to what Mr. Barsaville has spoke about earlier about with respect to the fact that summoning somebody is to be done only when it's necessary. And I think that's exactly the point. I don't think that it is necessary at this point. I think it's rather necessary when a person refuses to respond, or if they don't want to come before the committee, or if it's clear that they will not appear. So I don't know how much time has gone by. Maybe it's been 10 days, I'm not sure. And so the chair can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's only 10 days that have gone by since an invitation was extended to Madame Estraves. So for me, it's not clear or evident that we really should summon a person before this committee or before any committee. And that over the last, since the last election, sometimes people take a lot longer than 10 days to respond. So that's why I don't yet think it is necessary to summon anybody. So meanwhile, it doesn't cost us anything, but it will, however, cost a lot in terms of the precedent that will be created if we start summoning people. So once again, I don't yet think that it is necessary. And I think that we should use that tool only when it is absolutely necessary. So that's what I had to say on that.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to move to adjourn debate. Actually, adjourn the meeting. Adjourn the meeting.
Adjourn the meeting.
I think we have a motion on the floor. And she needs unanimous consent to adjourn the meeting?
No.
Yes.
Motion to adjourn is precedent over that.
Right.
So it's a dilatory motion, so it takes precedent. Right. So we
need to put the question before, right.
Well, the question on the floor is, shall the meeting be adjourned? Go ahead.
No, the question is the question on the floor, the motion.
No, the last question that was moved by me.
Was it dilatory motion? It takes precedent. Oh.
Mr. Bagnall?
In favor.
Mr. Baker?
In favor.
Monsieur Robillard?
En faveur.
Mr. Spangeman?
In favor.
Ms. Vandenbell? Mr. Benson?
Oppose?
Mr. Bazan?
Mr. Ruff is substituting in for Mr. Bazan. Mr. Ruff is substituting in for Mr. Bazan.
Okay. Mr. Ruff?
Oppose.
Mr. Dowdell?
Oppose.
Ms. Gallant?
Opposed.
Monsieur Barcelou Duval?
Pour.
Mr. Garrison?
Against.
Okay, that concludes the meeting. Meeting adjourned.